had been writing by the dim glow of the oil lamp, my hand cramped from a long evening spent refining notes on a lesser affair concerning a certain broker from Limehouse, when a sudden and violent knocking rattled the door below. At first I mistook it for some late returning tenant or drunken reveller stumbling against the steps, yet the sound came again. 3 sharp blows, deliberate, almost formal in their urgency. Holmes, who had spent the previous hour in uncharacteristic repose upon the settee, opened his eyes without stirring the rest of his body. The coal embers hummed faintly. The violin lay across the armchair with one string slightly out of tune, and the chill of the November air seeped through the window panes. No hansom passed outside. No wind carried the knock. It was unmistakably meant for us, and at such an hour it rarely signified anything ordinary. Holmes sat upright with that peculiar alertness which felt less like waking and more like shedding disguise. "You heard it," he said softly, as though any whisper might disturb the fragile moment before revelation. I nodded, reached for my cane, and descended the narrow staircase. The street was empty save for the faint shimmer of gaslight on wet cobblestones. Our visitor, however, was no passer-by. A figure stood rigid beneath the lamplight, gloves damp, coat muddied, eyes haunted by something which, even before a word was spoken, told me violence had already occurred elsewhere. If you wish to follow this account, as those seated beside me in the lamplight, remain attentive, for every detail I set forth has been recorded precisely as I recall it. The truth of that night was not revealed swiftly, nor kindly, and those who turn away early seldom grasp the full measure of these events. The stairway creaked beneath my steps as I descended to answer the late caller, each footfall accompanied by that uneasy sensation one experiences when the world outside seems to press in upon the lamplight within. London at that hour is not truly silent, but rather filled with a distant, slumbering murmur, hooves echoing over wet stones somewhere beyond sight, the low hum of gas pipes flexing as pressure shifts, the restless sigh of an empire that refuses to sleep even when its citizens do. Yet Baker Street, for that fleeting moment, felt devoid of life entirely. Even the street lamps flickered with a dimness unlike the usual lively orange glow, as though the flame itself recoiled from what approached. The figure at the door did not attempt speech immediately. His shoulders rose and fell in strained breaths, his gloves soaked through not merely with rain but streaked along the fingertips with a darker substance that glistened beneath the lamplight. When I drew nearer, he removed his hat slowly, like a man performing a ritual rather than a courtesy. He stepped inside only after I moved aside, and even then his boots remained just beyond the threshold, as though an invisible border held him back. I urged him forward politely, and he crossed while casting a furtive glance behind him toward the street, where nothing stirred. Upstairs, Holmes had risen to greet us, though he made no grand display of attention. He merely folded his hands behind his back as the visitor entered our quarters, his gaze drifting not to the man's face, but to his boots, then to the hem of his coat, and finally to the right cuff, where a faint tear exposed a thread of embroidery. I took the liberty of relieving our guest of his soaked garments, but Holmes stayed my hand with the smallest gesture. I understood at once. Every fibre mattered. "Pray sit," I offered. The man hesitated before complying, lowering himself into the chair nearest the fire. His pale complexion seemed ghostly against the warm glow, and the lines beneath his eyes suggested he had not slept for more than a night. In his trembling hand he held an envelope, unsealed but folded twice over, as though he had second-guessed its purpose repeatedly. Each time his grip loosened, the paper fluttered like a fragile wing desperate to escape. Holmes spoke first. "You have come from Hanover Square." The man jerked his head up with such force that I feared his neck might strain. How could you know that?" he breathed, his voice brittle. Holmes did not reply immediately. He circled behind the visitor, pacing slowly with the calculated elegance of a cat studying its prey. I recognized the pattern well. He had already deduced far more than he intended to reveal, and his silence served as both interrogation and invitation. "You might as well tell us how you arrived here," Holmes murmured. "There is mud upon your boots from the private gardens behind the square. The estates there allow access to the mews without passing the street, implying you departed in haste and not by the front entrance. As to why you fled, well, the folds of that envelope appear torn by a trembling hand, which suggests fear, not grief, and certainly not mere confusion." The man swallowed, his throat convulsing. When he spoke again, each word felt extracted rather than chosen. "There is blood in that house, Mr. Holmes. Not fresh. Not exactly. But it was not there when I left earlier in the evening. I returned to find the drawing room ruined, furniture overturned, candle wax spattered across the floor, and something— I hesitate to describe it." Holmes leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "Try." The man closed his eyes briefly, summoning resolve. Footsteps. Dozens of them circling the room. But there were no prints leading in or out, only around and around, as though the room itself had been full, yet no one remained. I felt an involuntary chill. The London night had its share of horrors, smugglers lurking beneath the docks, political conspirators whispering in gentlemen's clubs, and tragedies masked as accidents in the press, but something about the notion of silent footsteps in an empty room struck deeper into a region of the mind that reason alone could not comfortably illuminate. "And whose house is this?" I asked. He hesitated once more. "It belonged to a dear friend, Charles Redhaven." At the mention of the name, memories stirred in me unbidden. I had met Redhaven only once, many years prior, during an evening at the Lyceum while still fresh from service abroad. He possessed the kind of genial charm that wins confidences easily and too eagerly, though at the time I thought little of it beyond polite acquaintance. He had vanished from society soon after, murmurs suggesting illness, travel, or the quiet disgrace that accompanies debts of a political nature. Yet none of these rumors ever bore fruit, and eventually his name faded from drawing rooms entirely. Holmes spoke with renewed interest. "And you say the gathering expected tonight never occurred?" The visitor nodded weakly. "We were invited. More than a dozen of us, all corresponding to a list he dictated himself. But when we arrived, the house was dark, save for a single candle left burning beside a spilled glass. The servants claimed no preparations were made, yet I saw signs that the family had returned. The cloakroom held fresh garments, and letters upon the bureau bore dates no older than yesterday." Holmes strode toward the violin and plucked a single string, its note sharp enough to cut the air. "You left because you feared what you found." "I left," the man whispered, "because I heard footsteps following me through the corridor, though the hall was empty. They stopped each time I turned, then resumed the instant I faced ahead. By the time I reached the front door, I dared not look back." The fire snapped loudly, showering sparks across the grate. Holmes lowered himself into a chair opposite the man, folding his hands with that grave stillness he reserved only for matters that blended human danger with something more intangible. Those rare cases in which the facts themselves seem to resist explanation. "Your visit was not made merely to unburden yourself," Holmes finally said. "There is more." The man nodded with a hollow expression. "Yes, I found this on the mantel before I departed. It was addressed to you." He extended the envelope with trembling fingers. Holmes took it without flourish and held it near the light, inspecting not the writing but the paper itself. The seal, though broken, bore the faint impression of a sigil. A crescent enclosed within a square, lines raised in wax like a brand. Holmes studied it for several long seconds, and his expression shifted ever so slightly, as though a pattern long buried had begun to align itself. "Watson," he said quietly, "fetch your coat." I obeyed without protest. The visitor rose as well, uncertain whether he should accompany us or remain behind. Holmes gestured toward the stairs rather than the street. "For the present, you will stay here. You're in no condition to face whatever remains in Hanover Square tonight, and I have no desire to collect more frightened men from the pavement before dawn." We descended into the night once more, the envelope tucked within Holmes's coat. The air struck colder than before, and the lamps flickered in erratic pulses. As we walked, Holmes's silence carried the weight of internal calculation. I knew better than to interrupt when he drifted into that realm of deduction which lay beyond ordinary discourse. It was only when we approached the corner where Baker Street meets the broader thoroughfare that he finally spoke, his voice low and grim. "That seal, Watson. I have seen it only once before, and on that occasion it was associated with a disappearance no rational explanation could satisfy." "Whose disappearance?" I asked. Holmes halted beneath a gas lamp, its flame trembling as though startled by the night itself. He looked not at me, but somewhere beyond even his own thoughts. "A man who never returned home," he said, "and whose footsteps, according to all who searched, were last heard in an empty room." Before I could respond, a carriage turned sharply from the adjacent street, wheels skidding through rainwater. It halted too abruptly, horse snorting in panic. The driver stared at us with a rigid expression, yet he made no call, no gesture, no offer of transport. Holmes stepped toward him with measured caution, while I felt a tightening in my chest that had nothing to do with the cold. The driver met Holmes's eyes for a single moment, then flicked the reins and vanished into the night without delivering a word. Holmes watched the empty road long after the sound of hooves faded. His gaze narrowed, not in confusion, but recognition. Whatever lay ahead had begun to unfold long before our visitor knocked upon our door. He adjusted his collar and continued walking without explanation. The night felt suddenly less vast, as though unseen figures moved beside us, matching our stride. Holmes kept a brisk pace toward Hanover Square, his long stride cutting through the damp chill as if he meant to outwalk whatever shadow trailed us. The few cabs that still moved at that hour gave us a wide berth, the drivers glancing once, then looking away with that peculiar instinct Londoners possess for trouble. The city's wealth slept behind curtained windows and locked doors, but the pavements hinted at another life entirely. Cat's paws upon rooftops, whispers through alleyways, the soft clink of bottles outside public houses where laughter had already burned itself out. I drew my coat tighter, not merely against the cold, but against a creeping sense that we were walking straight into the heart of something half-formed and unwilling to be named. By the time we reached Hanover Square, the lamps around its perimeter burned low, casting a wan, exhausted light upon the railings. The residence indicated by our visitor rose above its neighbors in that stern Georgian fashion. Tall windows, strict symmetry, an air of having witnessed more than it cared to share. It might have been any house in that sober quarter, and yet, as we paused before the gate, I felt the distinct impression that it watched us in return, every shuttered pane and unblinking eye. Holmes paused to examine the steps, stooping with that deliberate precision I had seen 100 times before. He brushed his fingers along the stone and brought them close to the lamplight. There, beneath the damp, was a faint, brownish residue caught in a tiny crack. "Not fresh," he murmured, half to himself, "but not as old as the dust that surrounds it. The house has received visitors tonight, Watson, though not all departed as cleanly as they might have wished." He rang the bell. The sound echoed within with a hollow resonance, as if rebounding through a series of unfurnished rooms. After a time, we heard the drag of steps along the interior corridor and the accompanied rattle of keys. The door opened a narrow span, revealing a thin woman of middle years whose eyes bore the strain of sleeplessness, and whose cap had been donned hastily and crookedly. "We are expected," Holmes said gently, though he had not announced us beforehand. By a gentleman who found your drawing-room in a state of some distress." The housekeeper, if such she was, hesitated. Her gaze darted past us to the street, then back to our faces, measuring our appearance, weighing whether to trust us. "We have no visitors at this hour," she replied in a voice that aimed for firmness, but did not reach it. "The family is not receiving. The master is not here." "The master may not be," Holmes answered, "but the consequences of his absence are. You will, if you please, allow us to examine the drawing-room." Her hand tightened upon the edge of the door. "I cannot. The keys to that room were taken." "By whom?" Holmes asked quietly. She glanced over her shoulder, as if fearful that the walls might overhear. "I do not know. I keep them hanging upon a small hook in the pantry. There are no other sets. Yet this morning they were gone. I locked the front door myself last night. No one entered, no one left. Still," here she faltered, voice lowering, "still, the keys are not where they ought to be." Holmes fixed her with a steady gaze. "And yet someone has been in the drawing-room. You would not say it so lightly else." She swallowed, trembling, then stepped aside just enough to let us cross the threshold. "I will take you to the door," she said, "but I will not remain while you stand before it. I hear things there. I've heard them all evening." We followed her along a corridor lined with dark portraits whose painted eyes stared down with a solemnity bordering on accusation. A faint scent of extinguished candles lingered in the air, undercut by something sharper and more metallic. The housekeeper's steps quickened as we approached the end of the passage, where a tall double door stood closed, its surface unmarred save for the absence of a key in the lock and a small scratch along the brass plate as if a tool had slipped. "There," she whispered, stopping several paces short. "I will fetch a lamp from the back hall. I do not go closer than this after sunset." "Have you heard voices?" I asked before I could restrain myself. She shook her head, lips pressed tight. "Not voices. Walking back and forth, as if a crowd were gathering and dispersing, yet I know the room is locked. I have pressed my ear to the door more than once. There is nothing, and still the sound returns." Holmes moved forward alone, laying his palm flat against the wood. For a moment he stood thus, eyes closed, as if listening through his very bones. Then he produced a small instrument from his pocket, one of those delicate tools he kept for vexing locks, and knelt at the keyhole. The housekeeper retreated the way we had come, eager to put something solid between herself and that place. I watched Holmes work, the faint scrape of metal almost drowned by my own heartbeat. "You will have your revolver at hand, Watson," he said without looking up. "You expect danger?" "I habitually expect it," he replied dryly. "It saves time deciding when to be surprised." There came a soft click, barely louder than the ticking of a distant clock. Holmes rose, turned the handle, and eased the door inward just enough to admit a breath of colder air from within. A peculiar stillness drifted out with it, not merely the absence of sound, but the sense that any noise we made would be an intrusion upon something that had already transpired and could not be recalled. We stepped over the threshold together. The drawing-room spread before us in a breadth of shadowed elegance, lit only by the pallid wash of lamplight that seeped through the half-drawn curtains. It was a chamber intended for display. High ceiling, ornate cornices, walls lined with mirrors and portraits, a grand pianoforte at one end, and delicate chairs arranged once, no doubt, with practiced social calculation. Now, however, nothing sat where it belonged. An armchair lay overturned upon the carpet, one leg broken clean away. A small table had been knocked aside, sending a porcelain figurine to its death upon the floor. A solitary candle, burned nearly to its base, stood upon the mantelpiece, its flame extinguished but its wax frozen in chaotic drips that had clearly run while the room was in uproar. Holmes moved carefully, feet placed with such precision that the floor scarcely creaked. "Observe, Watson," he said in a tone that cut the silence without disturbing it. "There was no ordinary quarrel here. Quarrels are clumsy things. This He gestured lightly around us. "This bears the mark of orchestration." My gaze dropped to the carpet. It was there that the true disquiet began. Footprints, scores of them, marred the otherwise immaculate fabric. Some trod in straight lines, others curved, intersected, doubled back. They formed loops, circles, half-crescents, as though unseen dancers had traced patterns in slow, relentless repetition. Yet when I followed them toward the doors and windows, they thinned and dissolved into nothing. No entry, no exit, only circles. I knelt to examine the nearest print. "These are not all from the same boot," I observed. "See here, the heel on this one is narrower, and this print wider with a heavier edge." "Just so," Holmes replied softly. "At least 4 distinct pairs, I should say, possibly more. The depth varies as well. Some lighter, some pressing deep into the pile, men and women both, perhaps." "But they must have come from somewhere," I insisted, though my voice betrayed my unease. "They did not simply appear." Holmes crouched beside me, tracing the outline of one heel with a gloved finger. "Precisely the question, my dear fellow. If the housekeeper speaks true, this door has remained locked. Yet the room itself bears witness to a congregation. We must choose. Either the key has passed from hand to hand more freely than she admits, or someone has found a way to enter without her knowledge." His eyes drifted toward the windows. The heavy curtains, when drawn back, revealed glass unbroken, latches untouched. The balcony beyond was slick with rain, but bore no sign of recent disturbance. The hearth, though, told a different story. Ashes lay scattered not merely within the grate, but upon the surrounding tiles, as though someone had stirred them with purpose, seeking or burying some small object. Holmes knelt there next, his hands moving delicately through the debris. "Redhaven did not host trifling entertainments," he murmured. His gatherings, when they occurred at all, attracted those with reason to avoid scandal. One does not toss ashes about in such company by accident. I moved toward the pianoforte. One of its keys bore a faint smear of something dark, hastily wiped at but not entirely removed. When I pressed it, the note emerged thin and wavering, as if reluctant to be heard. I felt suddenly as though the room itself had been listening all along, and now, stirred by our presence, it wished to test our willingness to listen in return. "Holmes," I called quietly, "there is glass beneath the instrument." He joined me, and together we stooped to examine the glittering fragments. They were not from a window, but from a drinking glass of some elegance, likely one of a set. A few drops had dried upon the wood nearby, forming small, irregular circles. "Champagne," Holmes pronounced after a brief inspection, "likely opened earlier when the evening promised conviviality. The glass was broken in haste. Yet there is only one. Where are the others?" "Removed by the servants in their panic," I suggested. Holmes shook his head. "There is no smear upon the tray upon the sideboard, and no ring of moisture. Nothing has been cleaned here. We stand in a moment stopped midway between action and consequence." He moved toward the far corner, where a faint mark along the wallpaper caught his eye. There, at shoulder height, a scuffed streak interrupted the pristine surface. He touched it lightly. "This was no mere parlor conversation," he said. "Someone was pressed here, with force." The house seemed to exhale around us, the boards settling in slow protest. "Do you hear that?" I asked suddenly. Holmes lifted his head. For a long moment we both listened. The housekeeper's footsteps were not present. She had retreated far enough that her movements no longer reached us. Yet there it was, a soft, rhythmic sound, distant but unmistakable. A tread upon wood, measured and unhurried. One step, then another, then a pause. It did not come from the corridor, nor from above. Holmes's gaze drifted downward. The noise resumed, and this time I felt, rather than heard it, a faint vibration through the soles of my boots, as though someone walked directly beneath us. "The cellar," I whispered. Holmes nodded once, his expression sharpening into that keen, dangerous attentiveness which preceded every true revelation I had ever witnessed in his company. He crossed to the door and opened it fully, allowing more of the corridor's weak light to spill in. The footprints upon the carpet, innumerable as they were, seemed to converge subtly toward a single point near the hearth, a point where the pattern grew denser, the impressions heavier, before dispersing again in those maddening circles. "Watson," he said, his voice low and controlled, "we shall presently discover whether this house shelters a restless conscience or a living intruder. But mark what I say, whatever we find below will not be the beginning of this matter. It will be a remnant of something already set in motion long ago." The footsteps below ceased as abruptly as they had begun, leaving only the ticking of some unseen clock within the walls. The silence that followed was not empty. It was expectant, like a held breath. Holmes stepped back into the corridor, gesturing for me to follow. The door of the drawing-room closed behind us, with a hush of displaced air, and for a moment, as the latch settled into place, I could not shake the sensation that we were the ones now locked out, and that whatever moved within those circles of dust and carpet walked on without us, heedless of our investigation, leaving only echoes in its wake. Holmes led the way through the dim corridor, his footsteps careful, measured, betraying none of the tension that tightened the air around us. The housekeeper had withdrawn completely. No sound of domestic labor or nervous pacing reached us now. Hanover Square had fallen into that uncanny stillness peculiar to London's wealthier quarters at night, where silence feels less like peace and more like secrets holding their breath. The faint glimmer of gaslight along the banister reflected in narrow streaks, guiding us down a flight of stairs that curved toward the rear of the house. I kept close behind Holmes, one hand on the rail, the other resting near my coat pocket where my revolver lay concealed. Though I am no stranger to peril, there was something about that house, something swallowed rather than spoken, that placed me in a state of heightened readiness. At the bottom of the stairs, a narrow passage stretched before us, paneled in dark wood and poorly lit by a single lamp mounted near the far end. The walls bore the faint scent of damp stone and extinguished candles, as though air circulated only begrudgingly here. A series of doors lined one side, closets perhaps, or servant quarters once used but now abandoned. Holmes paused before each in turn, fingers grazing the hinges, inspecting whether they had been opened recently. Most bore dust upon the keyholes. One, however, had a handle unmarred by any film at all, as though touched again and again over the course of the night. Holmes placed his hand upon it, then withdrew. "Not this one," he murmured. "Someone wished it to appear as though they entered here. Too deliberate. The truth lies where effort was not spent." He moved on, stopping before a plain door nearly swallowed by shadow. The wood there was rough, its paint chipped, the lock older than the others. Few residences of quality retain such a portal unless it leads somewhere seldom meant for visitors. Coal cellars, storage vaults, or passages intended for deliveries conducted without ceremony. Holmes knelt, examining scuffs near the bottom edge. "This door was opened within the last hour," he said. "See here, the grain of dust broken in a straight line, and here, scratches from something heavy being dragged outward rather than inward." He rose and tested the handle. It resisted only slightly before yielding with a muted groan. Cold air breathed out from the darkness beyond, bearing the faint earthy smell of stone that has never seen sunlight. Holmes retrieved a lantern from a small wall hook, lit its wick, and stepped through. I followed, careful to keep the door from striking the wall behind us. The staircase descending from this threshold was narrow and steep, the steps uneven, their edges worn smooth by years of footfalls long past. The walls closed around us, damp to the touch, as though the house had grown downward into the earth like roots rather than being built upon it. Holmes lifted the lantern higher, revealing arching supports overhead, then paused as a faint sound reached us. One soft, hollow drip of water somewhere below, and beneath it, a subtler rhythm, like breath drawn slowly by a vast, sleeping creature. "Not wind," Holmes murmured. "The structure is too deep for drafts. Something moves here, Watson. Whether man or mechanism remains to be seen." We reached the cellar floor abruptly. The chamber opened into a wide space supported by stone columns, dimly illuminated by the lantern's feeble glow. Dust lay thick upon the floor, broken only by the trail of disturbed footprints leading inward, not the confused circles of the drawing room, but purposeful strides heading straight toward the far wall. The room held no crates, no coal heaps, no stored furniture. Instead, the space was bare except for several tall wooden screens arranged in a semicircle, their backs painted with pastoral scenes now tarnished by moisture. Holmes approached the nearest screen and ran his fingers along its frame. "These are no ordinary partitions. They have been placed to conceal rather than divide." He stepped around them, and I followed, heart quickening. Behind the screens, the floor bore markings, strange geometric impressions in the dust, as though something had been set there recently, then removed. Not one object, but several, arranged precisely in a pattern that might have been mistaken for ritual if it were not too mathematical in design. 12 circular indentations radiating outward from a central point, each equally spaced. Whatever had stood there left no trace of its nature, no ash, no residue, not even a stray thread. Yet the dust bore faint traces of fingers near the center, as though someone had knelt there, pressing hands into the earth. "What do you make of it?" I asked in a whisper. Holmes did not answer immediately. He walked to the farthest column, raising the lamp to examine etchings that had gone unnoticed in the shadows. At first I thought them cracks in the stone, but their arrangement was too deliberate. A series of intersecting lines, faintly carved into the surface. They were old, older than the house itself, their edges dulled by time rather than neglect. Holmes traced one with the tip of his glove, then stepped back, eyes narrowing. "These marks," he said softly, "predate the construction above. Either the house was built atop remnants of an earlier foundation, or something beneath the square dictated its placement." "You speak as if an architect would design a residence around scratches in stone." Holmes cast me a glance, not dismissive, but heavy with thought. "Not scratches, Watson. Coordinates. These lines correspond to the layout of the drawing room above. Each point here matches a point there. Chairs, windows, even the alignment of the pianoforte, as though the room was erected to echo the shape of this cellar." A cold sensation moved through me, not unlike the dread battlefield nights when artillery thundered beyond the horizon without warning. A design for what purpose? Holmes lowered the lamp, its glow shrinking around us. "That is what we must discover." Before we could examine further, a sound shattered the stillness. 3 sharp knocks, identical in cadence to the ones that summoned us from Baker Street. But these came not from above, nor from the passage behind us, but from somewhere deeper within, the earth beyond the far wall where no door should exist. The blows echoed, then ceased. Holmes extinguished the lantern instantly, leaving us swallowed in darkness. "Holmes," I whispered. "Silence," he breathed back. Footsteps followed. Not approaching, but retreating, their measured tread fading deeper into unseen corridors. The darkness pressed upon us, thick and weighty. Only when the last echo dissolved did Holmes relight the lantern. The floor before us was unchanged. The markings remained, but near the column, half concealed by dust, lay something new, a scrap of fabric caught upon a jagged crack in the stone. Holmes lifted it with his forceps. Velvet. The same deep crimson as the fragment we had found in the conservatory earlier that day. He folded it carefully into a paper envelope. "Whoever descended here tonight was no mere intruder," he said. "This is the trace of someone moving between both scenes, someone expected at that gathering but never seen in the open rooms." I felt the weight of the earth above us, and with it the knowledge that we were now implicated in something far vaster than an abandoned drawing room. Holmes closed the envelope and turned toward the stairs. "We leave," he said. "There is more to learn from the living before we return to the dead stone." Yet as we ascended, a final thought tugged at me, a faint scuff upon the stair just below my heel. Fresh. No wider than the curve of a fingertip, as though something had followed behind us in silence, retreating only when we approached the light. I did not mention it. Some truths announce themselves only when the mind is prepared to receive them. Holmes reached the upper corridor first and paused before opening the cellar door, listening once more for movement within the house. None came. He eased the door shut, and the latch slid home with a soft metallic sigh. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then Holmes said, barely above a whisper, "The footsteps we heard below were not wandering at random, Watson. They halted when ours began. We have been observed." We stepped back into the gas-lit hall, leaving the cellar behind. But the silence that followed us up those stairs felt less like relief and more like a presence climbing alongside us, unseen and patient, waiting for the moment we would hear it again. We departed Hanover Square not as triumphant investigators striding forth with clear intent, but as men momentarily expelled from a house that preferred to withhold its secrets until we earned the right to hear them. Holmes walked ahead of me, the envelope containing that velvet scrap held tight within his coat as though it carried heat. The rain, which earlier had fallen in thin, hesitant threads, now thickened into a steady patter that softened the shine of the street lamps and made the pavements glisten like obsidian. The night's earlier silence had given way to distant carriage wheels, the faint rattle of iron upon stone, and the occasional muffled call of a watchman. Yet nothing felt truly alive. London seemed to move mechanically, as though stirred by a restless dream rather than waking purpose. Holmes stopped once beneath the awning of a shuttered bookshop, shielding a match from the wind as he lit a cigarette. He inhaled only once before extinguishing it, half-finished. "The scrap from the conservatory," he said without turning, "and the scrap below the house. They are from the same garment, cut from a sleeve or hem in haste. We must assume the wearer attended the gathering that never occurred." "Or fled it," I suggested. "Yes," he murmured. "Or fled." We resumed our walk toward Baker Street, yet the route felt longer than before, as though the entire city stretched itself to delay our return. When we reached our rooms, Mrs. Hudson informed us that our visitor had regained some composure, taken tea, and spent the intervening hour in uneasy silence. We found him seated precisely where we left him, though his posture had changed. He now leaned forward with his hands clasped tightly, as though preparing to confess a matter that weighed more heavily with each passing minute. Holmes set the envelope upon the mantel and regarded the man with unblinking scrutiny. "You withheld information earlier," he said calmly, not as accusation, but inevitability. The man flinched, then nodded. "I did not intend to deceive you, but I did not know how to speak of it without sounding mad." Holmes seated himself opposite him, fingertips pressed together. Madness and truth are often confused by those who witness only the outcome and not the cause. Begin at the point where reason fails you. I shall trace back the line. The man swallowed hard. "Very well. I received my invitation 3 days ago, but it was not delivered by post. It was slipped under my study door while I slept. No wax seal, no handwriting. Only a card bearing the date and the address, printed with immaculate precision. I assumed it came from Redhaven's valet, or from Redhaven himself, and thought nothing amiss." "Yet you knew he had not been seen publicly for years," Holmes said. The man nodded. "His absence did trouble me, but I believe the invitation heralded his return. Many of us believe the same. We were once part of a circle, informal, with no official purpose. We met to discuss certain political matters, strictly privately, never published. When Redhaven withdrew, the circle dissolved. Yet his name still lingered among some of us, as though we expected him to resume his role once affairs abroad settled. Holmes leaned slightly forward. And what role was that? The man hesitated. I felt the weight of his reluctance, the way one does before uttering a thing bound by oath or shame. He brokered information, he said at last. Not secrets of state, but the kind that never reaches newspapers, whispers from parliament chambers, speculation about alliances, hints of discontent among certain nobles. He had a gift for knowing where truth might emerge before it did. Some said he cultivated this talent through connections. Others believed he possessed an uncanny instinct. I cannot judge which was true. And the gathering, Holmes pressed. It was to be our first reconvening in nearly 4 years. The card instructed us to arrive shortly after sunset. When I reached the house, I found several others already there, lingering at the gate, unsure whether to knock. The servants allowed us entry only after we insisted upon our invitation. Inside, the house felt strange. Rooms appeared prepared, yet untouched. It was as though every chair, every candle, every item had been arranged hours earlier and then abandoned the instant before our arrival. Holmes exchanged a quick glance with me. And Redhaven himself? Absent. No note, no explanation. We waited. After some time, we began to search each floor. That was when we found the drawing room in its bewildering state, and when the footsteps began. He shuddered visibly, gripping the arms of the chair. Not the sound of many men moving at once, nor the cautious tread of a lone intruder. It was aimless, a wandering, as though a crowd paced the floor without purpose, circling and circling, never speaking, never leaving. Holmes stood and paced slowly, his expression unreadable. Tell me, were there documents stored in that room prior to your arrival? Papers, correspondence, ledgers? Anything that might interest those who deal in secrets? The man blinked, taken aback. Yes, Redhaven kept a chest there, locked always. We assumed it held our old records. It was no longer present. The carpet beneath where it once stood was darker, as though shielded from dust until recently. Holmes stopped mid-stride. Watson, the pattern we observed below the house mirrors the absent chest's position above. Rooms built in parallel. Purpose hidden beneath social veneer. But why remove the chest? I asked. Holmes's eyes gleamed with that familiar flicker of revelation, half-formed. Not removed, relocated. If one wished to open it without witnesses, where better than a chamber no one above knows exists? A tremor passed through our visitor. You think someone moved the chest below, but where is it now? Holmes paused before the window, watching the street lamps quiver. Either taken farther underground, or carried away before we arrived. The man rose abruptly. Then I have endangered you both. If those who summoned us possess such access, we should not meet here openly. They will follow. Holmes regarded him with serene confidence. My dear sir, if they followed you, they already know you have come. Panic will grant them more advantage than stealth. The man sank back into his chair as though robbed of strength. The rain intensified outside, rattling the panes. Holmes tapped lightly upon the envelope containing the eyes velvet scrap. This fabric, he said, belonged to someone expected at that gathering. Someone close to Redhaven. Someone who did not depart the premises willingly. The man stared into the fire, voice barely audible. There was a woman, he said, years ago before Redhaven withdrew. A singer. He was fond of her, though she belonged to no circle and held no interest in politics. She vanished shortly after he did. I always wondered whether she followed him abroad. Holmes turned sharply. Name her. Amelia Harrow, he replied. She performed at the Opera House, once a rising star. Rumor claimed Redhaven funded her debut. Some say she was more than his companion, though neither ever spoke of it. Holmes closed his eyes for a long moment. When he opened them, his decision was already made. "We go to the Opera House tonight. If she has returned to London, others will know." The man stood, swaying slightly. "Should I accompany you?" "No," Holmes said. "You will remain here for the night. Mrs. Hudson will see to your rest. You are weary, and there are matters best investigated by men less known to this circle. These individuals once shared your trust. They may not share mine." The visitor bowed his head, defeated, and allowed Mrs. Hudson to lead him upstairs. When she disappeared with him, Holmes retrieved his coat and opened the front door. The rain struck harder now, forming rivulets along the stones like veins pulsing beneath skin. As we stepped outside, Holmes lowered his voice to a near whisper. "We must speak with Amelia Harrow, if she yet breathes. But mark this, Watson, whatever binds Redhaven's house to the chamber below did not begin tonight. We are walking among echoes, actions repeated after years of silence." We moved into the night, our boots splashing through shallow pools as gaslights bowed beneath the storm. The city stretched before us. Its theaters shuttered, its hansoms few, its grand facades blurred by water. Yet somewhere in that labyrinth of stone and memory, a woman's path converged with ours, and with it the truth of why footsteps still moved in rooms abandoned by the living. A faint musical note drifted on the wind, too distant to place, too fragile to dismiss. Holmes halted, head tilted, listening as though the city itself had spoken. When the sound faded, he resumed walking, faster than before. We did not speak again until the Opera House appeared through the rain like a great ship docked upon land, waiting for passengers who would never return. The rain eased as we neared the Opera House, though the wet cobblestones still reflected the gas lamps with such vivid clarity that each step felt like walking through a world layered atop its own shadow. The building loomed ahead, its grand facade softened by water and gloom, columns rising like ghostly sentinels. The banners that ordinarily announced performances hung limp and dark, their colors leached to drab cloth by the storm. A porter at the entrance tamped ash from a cigarette and eyed us with mild suspicion as we approached, though Holmes needed only stride past him with an air of belonging to render objections unnecessary. Inside, the atmosphere was markedly different from the deserted halls of Hanover Square. Even at such an hour, the Opera House possessed an echo of life, as though recent performances had left their applause suspended in the very dust. A pair of attendants extinguished lamps along the corridor, while a lone cellist rehearsed on the distant stage, the bow drawing slow, mournful notes that reverberated faintly along the velvet-lined walls. The chandeliers, unlit now, retained the memory of brilliance. Their crystals rattled softly with draughts that whispered between aisles. Holmes paused beneath the balcony rail, glancing up toward the private boxes shrouded in darkness. "A theater is never truly empty," he murmured. "It merely holds its audience in anticipation." We approached the stage door, where the night watchman sat hunched over a small ledger. He glanced up, blinked, and straightened his posture. "Closed for the night, gentlemen. No rehearsals beyond this hour." Holmes removed his hat politely. "We seek information, not performance. Miss Amelia Harrow, does she still sing here?" The watchman's eyes narrowed in thought. "Harrow? I recall the name, though she hasn't graced this stage in years. A firebrand she was. Bold voice, bold manner. Some said she'd conquer the continent. But she vanished." Holmes leaned forward slightly. "Vanished?" "Aye. One evening she finished a performance, bowed to the crowd, and left with her companions. She never returned the next night. No explanation, no farewell. Some whispered she eloped, others believed she fell ill. The papers took little interest. Singers come and go, but a few folk spoke of seeing her again, quietly lingering in the wings during rehearsals, never stepping into the light. Those tales never held firm. Holmes exchanged a glance with me. Brief, waited. And tonight? Has anyone by that name or resemblance been here? The watchman shook his head. Not to my knowledge, but you'd do better speaking to Madame Arvel. She managed vocal appointments then. She still holds the same office, though age has drawn her nearer to retirement. Holmes thanked him, and we wound through narrow hallways lined with aging posters, their edges curled, faces faded to ghostly silhouettes. The deeper we ventured, the more the theatre seemed to fold around us like a memory rather than a building. I could not help imagining Amelia Harrow in those corridors, her gown trailing along the carpet, her voice carrying long after footsteps ceased. The thought unsettled me more than I cared to admit. We found Madame Arvel seated in a modest office filled with sheet music, correspondence, and the fragrance of old perfume. Time had bent her spine slightly, yet her gaze was sharp as she regarded us over a pair of wire spectacles. Holmes introduced us with characteristic grace, omitting none of the courtesy owed to a woman who had once commanded stages through others' talents. We inquire about a former singer, Holmes said. Miss Harrow. The woman's expression softened into something like longing. A tragedy, that girl, she said quietly, though not in the way you imagine. Holmes inclined his head. Enlighten us. Madame Arvel folded her hands, gaze drifting beyond us to some recollection only she could see. Amelia possessed a gift that outshone her sense of prudence. She sang as though she offered her own soul to the audience, not merely her voice. Men adored her, patrons sought her favor, critics praised her with a fervor I have seldom seen. Yet she entrusted herself to the wrong companion. Redhaven? I asked. The older woman nodded. Yes. A gentleman of exceptional charm, though I never trusted his silence. He sat in box 3 for every performance she gave. They left together after her final night here, if indeed it was final. Holmes's voice softened but sharpened in intent. Did she speak of him before that night? Madame Arvel hesitated. She came to me privately, the evening before her disappearance. She asked whether I believed that a person could be summoned by duty rather than affection. I thought she spoke of her career. Now I suspect she alluded to something far darker. Holmes leaned forward. Did she leave anything behind? A letter, a note, sheet music. Anything in her hand? The woman rose with the slow dignity of habit and opened a lacquered drawer. From it, she withdrew a sealed envelope yellowed with age. This arrived 1 week after she vanished, she said. No return address. The handwriting matches her own. Inside is only a single line, no explanation. Holmes accepted the envelope reverently and opened it. The slip of paper within read, "The room was meant for us all, yet only one remained." The words sent a chill through me, for they echoed the emptiness of the drawing room and the footsteps circling in silence. Holmes turned the paper over, blank. No date, no signature, nothing to anchor its origin. "Have you shown this to anyone?" Holmes asked. "Only once," Madame Arvel replied. "To a man who claimed to be investigating Redhaven's affairs. He asked to borrow it. I refused. He left at once, though not before warning me that more inquiries would follow." Holmes's eyes sharpened. "Describe him." Tall, refined, gloves impeccably tailored. He wore a signet ring, a square enclosing a crescent. The very symbol stamped in the wax we had recovered. Holmes slipped the paper safely into his coat. "Madame, you have been of great service. If you value your peace, speak of this to no one." She nodded gravely. "I have remained silent for years. I shall remain so still." We took our leave. As we crossed the empty auditorium, the cellist had ceased playing, leaving the vast chamber in hush. The curtains hung black against the proscenium, their folds unmoving. Holmes paused at the center aisle, staring up at box 3, the very place Redhaven once occupied. "Watson," he murmured, "note the angle. From that vantage, one sees the conductor, the audience, the exits, and the shadows behind the curtains. the perfect seat for one who observes without participating. "And now?" I asked. Holmes stepped into the aisle, boots echoing upon polished wood. "Now we locate the others who attended this phantom gathering. They are scattered across London, each unaware how tightly the threads bind them. We must gather them before someone else does." We stepped outside once more. The storm had abated entirely, leaving the city slick and silent. Yet the air felt charged, as though lightning had struck somewhere unseen. Then, as we reached the curb to hail a cab, Holmes stiffened and lifted his cane slightly, signaling caution. Across the street, beneath the awning of a deserted tobacconist, a figure stood motionless. Cloaked, gloved, brim lowered. Their posture suggested neither curiosity nor concealment, but anticipation, as though they had waited expressly for us. Holmes met the figure's gaze from across the wet street, and for a moment London fell utterly still. Then the stranger stepped backward into the alley and vanished without a footfall, swallowed by darkness. Holmes exhaled slowly. "We shall be followed tonight, Watson. I trust this will not dissuade you." "You know well it will not," I replied. We turned toward Baker Street, the velvet scrap against Holmes's chest seeming to weigh more heavily with every step. Behind us, somewhere in the narrow lanes branching off the Strand, footsteps resumed, soft, unhurried, and never closing the distance. The cab that carried us from the Opera House rattled along the Strand with a peculiar urgency, as though even the horse sensed some unseen presence striding behind it. London had settled into that late hour when only certain rooms remained lit. Clubs where men discussed matters too delicate for daylight, drawing rooms where secrets became confessions, and nameless lodgings where the city's least acknowledged souls waited for dawn. I watched street after street slide past, each window a square of dim yellow honeycombed into the stone. Somewhere among them, Holmes believed, lay a mind that had already measured Redhaven's absence and weighed the value of silence against the coin of betrayal. Holmes tapped twice upon the roof of the cab, instructing the driver to halt not at Baker Street, but at the corner where the Strand narrows and bends toward a row of more modest establishments. "We shall not go home yet, Watson," he said quietly as we stepped down into the cool air. "Our observer outside the opera is not the only pair of eyes upon this matter. There is another, a woman, who has watched far longer than we have." "You speak of Amelia Harrow?" I asked. He shook his head. "No. Someone adjacent to her, yet not within her circle of applause. A voice that never reached the stage, but lingered in the wings. Redhaven was not a man to invest in only one singer when rumor could purchase others more cheaply." He led me along the slick pavement until we reached a discreet entrance that might easily be overlooked. Neither a tavern nor a formal restaurant, but one of those quiet establishments where artists, critics, and lesser patrons mingled in that ambiguous space between respectability and scandal. A faded sign above the door bore a name half effaced by weather. Light seeped from within, soft and amber, accompanied by the faint clatter of glassware and the low murmur of conversations pitched deliberately below eavesdropping level. Holmes pushed the door open. The air inside greeted us with the mingled scents of tobacco, wine, and an undercurrent of rosewater. Small tables clustered near the walls, each occupied by figures whose clothing suggested gentility, yet whose restless glances toward the entrance betrayed a constant readiness to depart if recognized. A man at the pianoforte brushed gentle chords that blurred into the background like the memory of music rather than its immediate presence. Holmes did not sit. He moved toward the far corner, where a solitary lady in a dark gown sat with her back half turned to the room, a glass of untouched claret before her. A veil concealed the upper half of her face, though I perceived from the set of her shoulders that she knew we approached long before we reached her table. "Miss Vale," Holmes said softly as he stood beside her, "you choose your vantage points well. From here one might observe every entrance and exit without once being forced into the light." The woman's gloved hand tightened around the stem of the glass, then relaxed. "I had hoped, Mr. Holmes," she replied in a voice low and resonant, "that your presence in the Strand tonight was rumor. Yet here you stand, tracking footsteps that have been slowly fading for years." Holmes inclined his head. "You have observed them longer than we. That is why I have come." She gestured toward the empty chair opposite her. "Then sit, but do not expect confession. A lady's livelihood here depends upon the careful distribution of fragments, not wholes." We obeyed, the chair legs scraping quietly against the floor. Up close, I saw that her veil was of fine lace, not the coarse material of mourning, and beneath it her eyes shone with a guarded intelligence. She was no debutante, nor was she of the lower class. Rather, she appeared to occupy that ambiguous station wherein a woman might trade in conversation, introduction, and discretion without formal title. "You know of Redhaven," Holmes said without preamble. She smiled faintly. "Everyone who matters in these rooms knew of Redhaven once. He had a talent for drifting wherever whispers began. But you did not come to me for old stories. You came because you believe I know why his drawing room stands empty." Holmes did not deny it. "You frequented his gatherings?" "Never openly," she replied. "Ladies such as I exist between thresholds, Mr. Holmes. We see everything, yet are seen only when it benefits others. Redhaven occasionally invited my patrons to his house. When they emerged, they spoke of music, of politics, of harmless eccentricities, but their eyes told a different tale. Some men leave cards behind in their haste. Others leave fragments of conscience." "And you gathered these fragments," Holmes said. "I listened," she corrected. "One does not gather smoke. One simply inhales and remembers its scent." She lifted her glass, but did not drink. "I heard of a chest, locked and always present. I heard of guests who received invitations twice, once by post, once by messenger, and could never prove which was genuine. I heard of Amelia Harrow, brought to sing not for the audience, but for a chosen few behind closed doors." Her gaze shifted to me. "And now I hear that a doctor from Baker Street walks through the dust of a drawing room where footsteps move without bodies." I started, caught off guard. "You are remarkably well informed." She gave a soft, humorless laugh. "Information is the only wealth some of us possess. We spend it carefully." Holmes rested his elbows lightly on the table. "What price do you ask for yours, Miss Vale?" She tilted her head, considering. "For now, only acknowledgement. Years ago, I warned a woman that Redhaven's invitations were not merely social. She did not heed me. If you seek to undo what was set in motion then, you must first know why she ignored my counsel." "Amelia," Holmes said. It was not a question. Miss Vale nodded. She believed herself chosen, anointed even. He spoke to her of legacy and sacrifice, of music that would outlast death. She mistook obsession for devotion. I told her a man who keeps a locked chest in a public room is not storing love letters. He is storing leverage. Holmes's eyes darkened. "Did she know of the chamber below the house?" Miss Vale's gloved fingers traced the rim of her glass in a slow circle. She spoke once of a place where sound behaved strangely. A room beneath another room where echoes grew stronger instead of fading. I assumed she described one of the rehearsal spaces. Now I suspect otherwise. I felt a chill reminiscent of the cellar's air. "Did she ever mention others gathered there?" "Yes," Miss Vale replied. "Men of standing, accustomed to being heard. Redhaven asked them to listen instead, to a kind of silence that unsettled even the most resolute. He believed the mind could be made more pliant in such conditions. I will not pretend to understand his methods, but I know this. After attending his private assemblies, some men altered their courses in life in subtle yet irrevocable ways. Votes shifted, alliances changed, paths diverged. Holmes's face remained composed, yet a spark of intensity sharpened his features. In short, his drawing room, and perhaps its twin below, became a stage upon which futures were rehearsed before they were enacted. Miss Vale's smile returned, this time tinged with melancholy. "You have a way of naming monstrosities in precise language, Mr. Holmes." "Yes." And then one night, they all ceased. The invitation stopped. The circle dissolved. Those who once boasted of their proximity to Redhaven afterward denied it. But the silence felt less like conclusion and more like an interval between acts. Holmes considered her closely. Why speak now? Her posture stiffened almost imperceptibly. For the first time, her voice held a hint of genuine fear. "Because tonight I saw a man in the street wearing Redhaven's seal upon his hand. Not a copied design, but the very ring I watched change fingers years ago when debts were paid in influence. Men who wear that mark do not appear without purpose. If he has returned, or if someone has claimed his legacy, then those old patterns will repeat with new victims." Holmes's tone softened. "And what is it you fear most, Miss Vale?" She lowered her gaze. "That he never left at all." The words hung between us like a curtain slowly descending. Holmes stood, leaving a coin upon the table. "If you receive any further whisper, however faint, concerning Redhaven or Amelia Harrow, you will send word to Baker Street." Miss Vale placed her hand over the coin without looking at it. "I've already taken my payment, Mr. Holmes. I've given you my last secret concerning them. Any more, and I shall find myself invited to rooms I've spent years avoiding." As we turned to leave, she spoke once more, her voice barely audible. "Dr. Watson." I paused, looking back. Her veiled gaze settled upon me with unsettling focus. "If you intend to follow your friend into that house again, do not go alone. And if you hear someone walking in the next room when all rooms are empty, remember this: sometimes the echo steps first. Only afterward does the body follow." The remark might have been dismissed as poetic superstition, were it not for the memory of vibrations beneath our feet in Redhaven's cellar. I inclined my head in thanks, though my gratitude felt insufficient to the weight of her warning. Outside, the Strand had grown quieter still. The cab we hailed seemed to emerge from nowhere, the driver's cloak pulled high against the lingering damp. Holmes remained silent as we rode toward Baker Street, his gaze fixed upon the rain-slicked streets sliding by. I knew better than to disturb the inward tempest of his deductions, yet a restlessness gnawed at me all the same. When at last we reached our familiar door and ascended the stairs, I found our earlier visitor asleep in the armchair, head bowed, the fire's glow flickering across his drawn features. Holmes regarded him for a moment, then moved to the desk where his scattered notes lay. He added Miss Vale's name to the growing web of connections, drawing a thin line from her to Amelia Harrow, another from Amelia to Redhaven, and a third from Redhaven to the crude outline of a ring enclosing a crescent. "Watson," he said, still facing the page, "we shall need to bring others into this circle of knowledge. Scotland Yard will blunder as usual, but there is one man whose unpolished honesty may serve us better than another's subtlety." "Lestrade?" I ventured. Holmes nodded once. "He is ignorant of the deeper currents, but he knows how men behave when guilt presses upon them. That will suffice for the next step." He reached for a telegraph form, then paused mid-motion, his hand hovering over the ink. The floor at that moment vibrated with the faintest tremor, so slight one might have mistaken it for a trick of the nerves. Somewhere in the house, a board creaked. Our visitor stirred in his seat but did not wake. Holmes's eyes met mine. No one moved in the corridor. No door opened or closed. Yet for an instant, it felt as though someone had walked through the drawing room of Baker Street itself, leaving behind no trace but the lingering impression of a footfall in the air. Holmes lowered the pen without writing and listened, his head tilted, every sense poised. The sound did not come again. But the silence that followed was no longer the familiar comfort of our rooms. It felt like the pause before a hand knocks upon a door that has not yet been built. Holmes did not sleep that night, though our exhausted visitor succumbed to slumber almost immediately, his breathing uneven, as though even rest carried remnants of fear. The lamplight waned to a low amber glow, throwing long shadows across the carpet where stray pages of Holmes's notes lay scattered like discarded leaves. I sat opposite him, my own weariness held at bay by the peculiar tension that had settled over the room, a tension not born of urgency, but of anticipation. Holmes leaned forward with his elbows upon his knees, chin resting against interlaced fingers. The fire had dwindled to faint red embers, yet he stared into them as though interpreting some message written in flame. At last, he spoke without shifting his gaze. "You recall the slight tremor upon the floorboards moments ago?" I nodded. Perhaps the building shifted with the wind. "There was no wind," he replied quietly, and the vibration matched neither carriage nor footfall from the street. It originated within the walls. "You suspect someone entered?" "I suspect," he murmured, "that someone wished us to know they could." He rose suddenly and crossed the room in 3 swift strides, examining the lower molding near the hearth. His fingers traced the seam where the panel met, the floor. I watched in silence, resisting the temptation to rise and peer over his shoulder. When Holmes concentrated, even breath became an intrusion. "Not loosened recently," he said after a moment. "If there is ingress, it is not here." The visitor stirred in his chair, muttering incoherently in his sleep. Holmes's expression softened briefly. "He carries the burden of knowledge poorly. Some men are not designed to bear secrets." "Few are," I replied. "Your constitution is exceptional in that regard." Holmes gave a faint smile. "Perhaps. Or perhaps mine is merely the only one you have observed closely enough to judge." His tone held no vanity. Rather, it echoed a truth long established between us. He returned to the table, unrolled a sheet of thin parchment, and placed the velvet scrap upon it. The fabric seemed to drink the lamplight, its deep hue absorbing illumination rather than reflecting it. Holmes took up a magnifying lens and bent low. "Watson," he said after a time, "do you see this stitching?" I leaned closer. At first the threads appeared ordinary, hand-sewn, though with the practiced expertise of one accustomed to finer garments. But beneath the primary seam ran a second, subtler stitch along the inside edge, executed with irregular tension. "A hurried repair," I suggested. Holmes shook his head. "A concealment. Something once attached here has been removed." He turned the cloth in his hands, examining its reverse. There are faint traces of metallic residue, copper alloy perhaps, or brass. A brooch, an insignia, or a clasp fastened to the sleeve. Whatever was affixed bore significance, else it would not have been cut away so crudely. The visitor groaned in his sleep, shifting beneath the blanket Mrs. Hudson had placed upon him. Holmes lowered his voice. If this belonged to Amelia Harrow, then she wore something marked. Something she wished to hide, or someone wished to strip from her before she fled. I felt a chill that no hearth could warm. "Do you believe she's still alive?" Holmes lowered the lens. "Alive, yes. Safe? No." He folded the cloth and placed it in the inner pocket of his coat, as though shielding it from the night itself. Then he drew a breath with resolution. "We must locate the remaining members of Red Haven's circle. The truth lies not merely in what they saw, but in what they chose not to confess." I frowned. "They are men of influence. To confront them openly risks drawing attention." Holmes clasped his hands behind his back and paced, "Which is why we shall not confront them openly." Before I could press the matter further, a soft knock sounded upon the door. Polite, measured, so faint one might have imagined it. Holmes stilled mid-step. The knock came again, slightly firmer, 3 taps spaced precisely. We exchanged a glance. Our visitor remained asleep. The house beyond our sitting room was silent. Holmes crossed the floor and opened the door without hesitation. Lestrade stepped inside, soaked from the lingering rain, hair plastered to his brow, coat glistening. He carried no lantern, no uniformed escort, only the harried expression of a man awakened from uneasy sleep to pursue something against his better judgment. "Holmes," he said, lowering his voice once the door shut behind him, "you will tell me candidly whether you are involved in the affair at the river." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Which affair?" Lestrade removed a folded document from his coat and laid it upon the table. The paper bore a yard heading, its ink smudged from moisture. Holmes read silently. I leaned closer. The report described the discovery of a body pulled from the Thames that evening. Male, unidentified, finely dressed, bearing a fracture to the skull and a torn scrap of velvet clinging to his coat. My blood chilled. The velvet matched ours. Lestrade continued. "We thought he'd been robbed, but there was no sign of forced struggle. No stolen watch, no missing rings. Only that scrap, as though someone tore something from him." Holmes placed the document upon the table with deliberate calm. "You believe the man may be connected to us?" Lestrade sighed. "I believe your cases have a strange habit of leaving corpses in their wake, and when a body is found in evening dress with a crest upon his cuff torn away, I begin to think you have sight of threads the rest of us cannot." Holmes regarded him with respectful gravity. "We know of the body, though we did not expect it so soon. The scrap upon him matches fabric we found elsewhere. The emblem removed held meaning." Lestrade scoffed. "Meaning? It held trouble. I have half a mind to drag the garment across to every tailor in Mayfair until someone names the owner." Holmes offered him a thin smile. "Do not trouble yourself. The garment did not originate in Mayfair." Lestrade waited for elaboration. None came. Instead, Holmes said, "You must keep the identity of the deceased from the press. Not because his reputation must be protected, but because panic would serve the one orchestrating this drama far too well. He desires attention. We must deny it." "I'm not accustomed to receiving orders from you," Lestrade muttered. Holmes stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Not orders, advice. I do not speak for my own sake, but for yours. If the circle this man belonged to realizes he has been found, they will close ranks. You will lose the chance to observe what they do in the aftermath." Lestrade studied him for a long moment, torn between suspicion and reluctant trust. "Very well, Holmes. But if this affair leads us into scandal among the peerage, you will be the one explaining it to the commissioner." "I look forward to the conversation," Holmes replied. Lestrade turned to leave, pausing before the threshold. "Be wary," he said. "There are those who do not appreciate being turned into puzzles." Holmes bowed his head, a sentiment I share. "Good night, Inspector." When Lestrade departed, the door closing softly behind him, Holmes remained motionless, listening to the fading sound of his boots descending the stairs. Then he exhaled. "This changes our calculation," he said. "No longer are we merely observers. The circle has begun to shed its own members." I stared at the dying embers of the hearth. "And we are next?" Holmes's eyes revealed no fear, only certainty. "We are not next. We are already included." He extinguished the final lamp, leaving only the faint glow of coals to paint the room in ghostly light. Our visitor slept still. The scrap of velvet rested against Holmes's heart, and the house, though silent, felt inhabited by something other than ourselves. I closed my eyes, prayer half formed upon my lips, hoping for rest. Yet before sleep claimed me, I heard it once more, quiet, measured, unmistakable. A single footstep in the corridor. No one walked there. No door opened. Yet the echo came all the same. Dawn came to Baker Street not with the cheerful bustle of a new day, but with a pallid wash of light that seemed to hesitate upon the window panes before entering. I woke from a sleep riddled with fractured impressions. velvet turning to river water, footsteps circling without bodies, the echo of Miss Vale's warning threaded through it all. Holmes had risen before me, as was often his habit. I found him standing at the table, sleeves rolled, his hair disordered in that particular way that indicated a night spent in continuous thought rather than rest. Upon the table lay a series of sheets torn from old newspapers, spread flat and weighted at the corners by ink bottles and a small chemical burner. Across them, Holmes had drawn lines in black pencil, intersecting at angles that, to my eye, resembled little more than an increasingly complex web. At the center of this arrangement he had sketched the outline of Redhaven's drawing room, all measured with the precision of a draftsman. From that central block, further lines radiated outward, connecting to other shapes labeled with names and locations: Hanover Square, Opera House, Strand, Thames. Our visitor, who had slept in the armchair, now lay stretched upon the settee, breathing more evenly. Mrs. Hudson had checked on him at first light and pronounced him physically sound but in need of quiet. Holmes acknowledged her report with a distracted nod, then returned to his diagrams. "You observe, Watson," he said without looking up, "that the footprints in the drawing-room are not truly chaotic." I approached the table. "They seemed quite chaotic when we first encountered them." "Yes," he replied, "because we viewed them only in fragments, while our minds sought meaning in familiar patterns. But consider this." He tapped the central sketch of the room. "We have circles, loops, crossings, yet the density of these prints increases near the hearth, then thins near each window. Such imbalance is seldom accidental. The room itself is a cipher. The question is, for whom was it written? You believe the arrangement of footsteps encodes a message?" "Not in the crude sense of letters replacing letters," he said. "Rather in the sense that a series of movements may reveal intention. Think of a dance in which partners exchange places. The steps, if recorded, tell us who was meant to meet whom and where." He reached for a pencil and marked a small cross upon the carpet outline. Here, near the hearth, the prints overlap excessively. Here, near the pianoforte, they split, lighter and heavier impressions diverging, and here, near the window, they halt entirely, as though some invisible barrier prevented further approach. If we transpose these points upon a second plane, the cellar below, certain alignments become apparent. He turned one of the newspaper sheets, upon which he had sketched the cellar's columns and the ring of indentations we had observed. The marks from the drawing-room aligned in his rendering with the circular impressions beneath, forming a pattern reminiscent of a clock face. "Imagine," Holmes continued, "that each position corresponds to a person, and each movement dictates whose eyes rest upon whom at a given moment. One could arrange a conversation without words, a silent council in which influence passes like a lantern around a circle." "Why such elaborate design?" I asked. "Men of influence can simply speak." Holmes's eyes hardened. "Because some agreements cannot be risked in speech, even behind locked doors. Gesture, stance, direction of gaze. These things may be observed, but not easily recorded. A room built for such assemblies is not a drawing room at all, but a device." I shivered, feeling anew the weight of the house above that cellar. "And the moonlight?" Holmes smiled faintly. "Ah, you recall the heading I gave this portion of my notes. Yes, the moonlight. There is a peculiarity I have not yet shared with you. When we examined the drawing-room, the lamps outside were weak, their light filtered through cloud and rain. Yet on a clear night, the windows along the southern wall would admit a narrow band of moonlight at a particular hour, falling not upon the center of the room, but along the edge of the hearth." He gestured toward his sketch, where he had drawn a thin line representing the beam. "If my calculations are correct, the moon's path on certain nights of the year would align precisely with one of the circular pathways in the carpet. Those walking that route would step in and out of shadow in a pattern visible to all present." "And what purpose would that serve?" I asked. Holmes's voice grew softer. Suppose, Watson, that agreements were not merely spoken, but enacted. Those whose steps passed through the light pledged themselves to a course. Those who remained in shadow withheld consent. The very floor would betray allegiance. I felt an odd discomfort at the idea of so much meaning compressed into simple movement. You speak as if Redhaven orchestrated some ritual. Holmes shrugged lightly. Call it ritual if you wish. I prefer to view it as a mechanism for sorting loyalties without the inconvenience of minutes or witnesses. But the important point is this. Someone constructed his house to make such arrangements possible. Someone understood the language of architecture and light. That person, I suspect, is still at work. The morning passed into afternoon as we revisited every detail we could recollect. Holmes dispatched a telegram to Lestrade requesting a private opportunity to view the body recovered from the river, phrased with sufficient vagueness to avoid arousing the curiosity of any telegraph clerk with a habit of reading between words. Another message, shorter and sharper, went to a minor official Holmes occasionally employed for discreet document searches, directing him to inquire after property records tied to Hanover Square and any unexplained alterations beneath. Our visitor woke near midday, pale but steadier. Holmes questioned him again, this time with a gentleness I had rarely seen. The man recalled little more of the evening in the drawing-room. His fear had smudged the details into impressions rather than memories. Yet one remark emerged that Holmes seized upon with quiet intensity. There was music, the man said. I am certain of it now, not during the commotion, before. When we first arrived, we heard faint notes from the drawing-room, soft like the end of a melody. By the time we entered, they had ceased. Holmes nodded, satisfied. Thank you. You have given us more than you know. When the man asked whether he might return home, Holmes reluctantly agreed, cautioning him to speak to no one of his visit. Once he left, the rooms returned to that peculiar stillness broken only by the scratch of Holmes's pencil and the occasional distant clatter from the street. By evening, the sky had cleared completely. Moonlight pooled upon the rooftops and spilled into the narrow lanes, softening the sharp edges of chimney and cornice. Holmes stood at the window, watching the pale disk rise above the opposite houses. It is a fortunate turn, he remarked. We shall have the moon tonight. I needed no further explanation. We were returning to Hanover Square. We approached the house by a circuitous route, avoiding the main thoroughfares. The square itself lay bathed in a subdued silvery glow. The residence loomed as severe as ever, yet beneath moonlight its facade took on a more spectral quality, as though the stone might crumble at a touch. Holmes produced a key, no doubt fashioned from his earlier observations, and opened the door with quiet efficiency. The interior welcomed us with familiar chill. The housekeeper was nowhere to be seen. Perhaps she had retreated to some distant corner rather than confront the drawing-room after dark. Perhaps she had left altogether. In either case, we moved unchallenged through the corridor. In the drawing-room, the transformation was immediate. Where before lamps and our own lantern had governed visibility, now the moon laid a long, narrow strip of light across the carpet, cutting diagonally from the southern windows toward the hearth. Dust motes drifted within that beam like particles frozen in water. The footprints we had observed earlier appeared clearer now. Certain sequences intersected the moonlit path, while others curved conspicuously away. Holmes stepped just beyond the edge of the light, careful not to disturb the dust more than necessary. His gaze traced the route of those prints that stood out deepest. Here, he said, pointing. Notice how this series enters the light at regular intervals, as though the person walked with an unbroken pace. No hesitation, no break. Whoever this was moved with purpose. And this one? I asked, indicating a set of lighter impressions that approached the beam, stopped short, and retreated in a half-circle. Fair, Holmes replied simply. Or doubt? A person unwilling to commit themselves to whatever the light signified. He followed the decisive prints, step by step, mapping their course in his mind. They looped once around the room, then converged near the hearth, where they joined others in a dense cluster. It was here, he murmured, that the true exchange occurred. He knelt, examining the floorboards at the edge of the hearth. The carpet, I now noticed, bore a slight irregularity at that point, a faint rise, as though something lay concealed beneath. "Help me, Watson," Holmes said. Together, we lifted the corner of the carpet carefully, folding it back just enough to expose the boards beneath without erasing the remaining pattern of dust. Beneath the hearthstone, one plank differed from the others, shorter by half an inch, its grain reversed. Holmes produced a thin blade from his pocket and pressed it along the seam. The board yielded with surprising ease, revealing a narrow compartment roughly the length of a man's forearm. Within lay a slender object wrapped in oilcloth. Holmes raised it gently and unwrapped it under the moon's pale gaze. It was a cylinder of glass, sealed at both ends with wax darkened by age. Inside, rolled so tight as to appear almost fused, was a strip of parchment. No writing was visible through the glass, only the suggestion of inkstrokes turned inward. "A message," I breathed. Holmes's expression remained inscrutable. "Or a record, perhaps of those who stepped into the light, perhaps of agreements sealed here in silence." He held the cylinder against the moonbeam, turning it slowly. For an instant, a shape flickered across the parchment, lines intersecting, a symbol formed of square and crescent, the same sigil as the broken seal. Holmes lowered it at once, as though wary of revealing too much even to the night itself. "We shall not open it here," he said. "Too many eyes may yet linger in these walls. The contents belong to no one present, which makes them dangerous." As we replaced the board and carefully restored the carpet, a faint sound rippled through the room, a whisper of movement, like the brushing of cloth along the far wall. I straightened abruptly, heart pounding. "Did you hear that?" I asked. Holmes's gaze swept the shadows. "Yes." The footsteps, when they came, were not upon the carpet, nor from the corridor beyond. They sounded from above, directly over our heads, measured and unhurried, traversing the ceiling from one side of the room to the other. We stood motionless, listening. The steps halted above the hearth. Then, as if in answer to our discovery, a single, gentle tap sounded within the chimney shaft, far above the grate, nowhere a living hand could easily reach. Holmes closed his fingers more tightly around the glass cylinder. "Come, Watson," he said softly. "We have taken from this room what we came for. It is only courteous to leave before our host decides to show himself." We quit the house at Hanover Square with the utmost discretion, ensuring no shadow tracked our departure. The moon, now higher, cast a pallid sheen over the square so complete that the trees along its perimeter resembled skeletal silhouettes, branches like outstretched fingers clawing at the sky. Holmes walked without haste, yet his posture held a taut readiness I had witnessed only when we returned from peril rather than entered it. The glass cylinder, now concealed in his coat beneath the left lapel, shifted faintly with each step, its presence a silent weight between us and the night. We took a circuitous route home, avoiding the more conspicuous thoroughfare. Holmes paused once beneath a street lamp to study the pavement behind us, though no sound or movement betrayed pursuit. Still, he resumed our journey, not toward Baker Street, but toward the embankment, as though proximity to the river might offer clarity rather than risk. The Thames at night possesses a peculiar temperament, neither silent nor loud, neither restful nor agitated, but ancient, brooding, full of things London has thrown into it in fear or desperation. The lamplight rippled upon its black surface like shattered glass, and the air carried a faint metallic tang. Holmes leaned against the stone balustrade, his gaze fixed upon the water. "The cylinder was placed there for someone who knew where to look," he said quietly. "Yet it remained unopened long after Redhaven vanished. which means either the intended recipient never returned or never escaped. And the footsteps? I asked. Were they reenactments, ghosts of a past ritual, or new participants continuing the design? Holmes did not answer immediately. He drew the cylinder from his coat and held it lightly in both hands, turning it so that the wax-sealed ends caught the moonlight. The glass did not merely reflect the light, it refracted it, sending thin slivers of illumination across his knuckles like threads of silver. No ghost, he said finally. Not in the supernatural sense. Footsteps do not imprint dust without weight. Yet the pattern we observed is not the product of minds acting freely. It is choreography, repeated, memorized, obeyed. Someone is still practicing what began years ago. Practicing for what? Holmes exhaled slowly, eyes still fixed upon the river. For the night the circle gathers again. A chill traced my spine, though I could not say whether it came from the cold air or the implication in his voice. The notion of men, living, powerful, silent, reassembling in that chamber above and below, compelled by some half-spoken agreement, unsettled me more deeply than any violent crime. Murder has motive and end. This had neither. Holmes replaced the cylinder in his coat. We returned to Baker Street. There is much to be done before we dare open this. The journey back took place in resolute silence. When we reached our lodgings, Mrs. Hudson had already retired, and the lamps upon the stairwell burned low, leaving the hallway in a haze of amber gloom. Our visitor, who had left earlier in the day, had taken his belongings, though not without leaving behind an impression of lingering unease. Holmes set aside his coat and placed the glass cylinder upon the table with the care of a surgeon preparing to operate upon a living heart. "You intend to open it tonight?" I asked. He shook his head. "Not without proper instruments. The wax seals are old, and the glass delicate. A careless touch might damage the record. And if the document within reveals names or agreements, we cannot risk destroying any portion." He cleared the table of scattered notes, stacking them with unusual precision, then retrieved a locked tin from the bookshelf containing slender tools suitable for delicate work. Fine tweezers, a heating coil, a lens polished to clarity. Yet he did not open the kit. He merely placed it beside the cylinder and sat. "Watson," he said softly, "tell me again what you recall from the cellar." I closed my eyes, summoning the memory of damp stone, the ring of indentations, and the scrap of velvet caught upon the crack. "It felt as though the ground remembered us," I said at last, "as though someone had just left." Holmes nodded. "And the footsteps above our heads in the drawing room, they matched the spacing of the cellar columns. That is no accident. The rooms are not simply aligned, they are connected by intent. What is enacted above resonates below, and below, perhaps, shapes what transpires above." He leaned back, studying the ceiling as though imagining the paths of invisible figures. The fire crackled gently, almost cheerfully, in stark contrast to the gravity of his deductions. "We must next determine whether other houses share this peculiarity," he said. "Circles of influence seldom occur in isolation. If Redhaven's gatherings affected policy, as Miss Vale implied, then others must have been built to accommodate similar designs. We require property records not merely for Hanover Square, but for other estates owned by those in the circle. And to find those names," I said, "we must open the cylinder." "Yes," he replied, voice scarcely above a whisper. "But I am reluctant to do so until daylight. Night has a manner of distorting meaning." He rose and went to the window, drawing the curtains only halfway. The city beyond was quiet, the gas lamps flickering in slow rhythm. Holmes stood motionless, listening, not to sound, but to the absence of it. "Watson," he said after a time, "observe the street." I joined him. Across from us, a cab stood idle beneath a lamp-post. At first I thought it vacant, but as my eyes adjusted, I saw a figure in the passenger seat, still upright, face turned toward our window. The horse did not stamp or shuffle. It stood as though carved from obsidian. The driver sat rigid, hands upon the reins, unmoving. "How long have they been there?" I asked. Holmes did not blink. "Long enough." "What do they want?" Holmes replied in a tone both calm and grave. "To see whether we would bring the cylinder home, and to learn whether we will betray impatience by opening it." The figure in the cab did not depart, nor did he signal. Holmes closed the curtain fully. "We shall give them nothing tonight." We extinguished the lamps one by one and retired to our rooms. I slept poorly, for every creak of the house seemed to align itself with memory. Footsteps below, footsteps above, footsteps circling in a room where men once gathered to bind each other to unspoken fates. Sometime before dawn, I awoke to a faint sound, not loud enough to startle, but distinct enough to pierce the veil of sleep. A soft click, like glass tapping wood. I sat up, heart pounding. Moonlight stretched across the floorboards in a long white bar. The table where Holmes had placed the cylinder stood clearly in view. The cylinder was no longer upright. It lay on its side, wax end pointing toward the door, as though someone had rolled it carefully from its resting place and set it down with surgical precision. Holmes appeared in my doorway as though drawn by the same sound. He said nothing. He simply looked at the displaced cylinder, then lifted his gaze to mine. "You see," he murmured, voice low and composed, "our visitor does not knock. He waits." He bent to retrieve the cylinder, turning it over in his hands. No seal was broken, no parchment disturbed, yet along the glass, barely visible in the moonlight, a thin smear of condensation traced the curve where a fingertip might have rested. Holmes straightened, eyes narrowing. "They have touched what they want," he said. "They did not need to take it. They only wished to show they could." He did not return the cylinder to the table. He kept it in his hand as dawn broke, as though sleep might invite further trespass. Morning in London is a peculiar thing when one has passed the night in the company of unseen hands and untouched seals. The city awakens in stages. First the rattle of milk carts upon cobbles, then the distant cry of vendors, then the slow stirring of blinds and curtains as households admit a reluctant grey light. On that particular morning, Baker Street seemed to join the work of waking with more reluctance than usual, as if the very bricks sensed we had acquired something the night had wanted for itself. Holmes had not slept at all. He sat in his armchair with the glass cylinder resting on a folded cloth upon his lap, his fingers lightly draped over it as if keeping watch. The thin smear upon the glass, faint, vanishing as the room warmed, persisted in my thoughts like a half-heard melody. Mrs. Hudson entered with breakfast and glanced at the object only once, her good sense intuiting that whatever it contained was no business of hers. She withdrew quickly, not from fear, but from an instinctive resolve not to stand between Holmes and whatever storm gathered beyond our window. "You are pale, Watson," Holmes remarked as I took my seat. "The night has not been kind." "You fared no better," I replied. "Yet you sit as though you have merely changed positions in your thoughts rather than in your body." He gave a faint, almost apologetic smile. "The mind is a restless tenant. It refuses to pay heed to the landlord's complaints." His gaze returned to the cylinder. "We cannot postpone the next step any longer. Before we open this, we must understand the nature of the circle it describes. Every line of ink will mean more if we already know the pattern of lives into which it is woven." "You speak of the War Office," I said quietly. "Yes," he replied. "Redhaven's name appears not in the press, not in society columns, but in whispers attached to operations that never occurred officially. Miss Vale hinted at it. Our visitor felt it without knowing how to name it. We shall pay a call on certain archives beneath Whitehall where old plans go to moulder in dust. Or wait. And you expect them to open their doors to us?" Holmes reached for his coat. "Not to us. Not officially. But there are clerks, Watson, men who live among papers as others live among fields. They recognize the footprints of power even when the names are erased. We left Baker Street under a sky the color of pewter, the cylinder secured in a padded inner pocket of Holmes's coat. The watchers who had stationed themselves in the cab the previous night had vanished with the darkness, yet the absence of their presence felt more ominous than their observation had. To see one's enemy is to quantify him. To feel him depart without knowing where he has gone is another matter entirely. Whitehall received us with its usual imposing austerity. Long facades of stone, guarded entrances, windows that seemed to observe rather than merely admit light. Holmes led us through a lesser door to the side where a clerk who knew him by sight bowed us through with minimal question. We descended a flight of narrow stairs into a region of cool, dry air and restrained conversation, a place where the noise of the street shrank to a distant murmur. The archives resembled a kind of subterranean forest, though the trees were iron shelves and the leaves were paper. Files, boxes, and ledgers lined the corridors in disciplined ranks, each labeled in neat script, each bearing the weight of decisions taken and then forgotten by all but those who kept them. A single gas jet hissed quietly at intervals, casting enough light for work but not enough for comfort. A thin man in spectacles approached, his ink-stained fingers betraying years spent in service to records rather than people. Holmes greeted him with an ease that suggested prior acquaintance. "Mr. Pell," Holmes said, "your kingdom expands. I trust none have yet dared to disturb its order." The clerk's mouth twitched into the ghost of a smile. "Not while I draw breath, Mr. Holmes. You once asked me to locate a memorandum that had never officially existed. I assume your request this time will be no simpler." "On the contrary," Holmes replied, "I merely wish to know whether a certain name appears at all." "Lord Charles Redhaven." Mr. Pell's expression sharpened with interest. "Redhaven," he repeated. "Not one of our more frequently cited gentlemen. Wait here." He vanished between the shelves with a speed that belied his frail appearance. Holmes and I remained standing, our footsteps absorbed by the floor. After some minutes, Pell returned, bearing a slim folder bound with worn string. "Curious," he murmured. "His name is attached to surprisingly few documents, and those it adorns are uncommonly vague. Yet the absence is almost as eloquent as the presence." Holmes accepted the folder and opened it upon a nearby table. We bent over the contents together. There were no detailed reports, no explicit accounts of operations. Instead, numbers appeared beside references to discretionary funds, anonymous benefactors, and unofficial consultations. Several lines had been struck through with a heavy hand, leaving only faint phantom letters behind. "At first glance, very little," I said. "This could refer to any number of philanthropic interferences." Holmes nodded. "And yet note the pattern. Here, 3 years before Redhaven's withdrawal from society, an allocation for logistical support abroad is routed through an unnamed intermediary in London. The next year, a similar entry appears, this time indicating private consultation with civilian advisor R. Then, nothing. No more funding, no more consultations, no official mention of him at all. Yet the activities these entries touch upon did not cease. They merely ceased to be recorded." Mr. Pell cleared his throat gently. "Strictly speaking, gentlemen, I must remind you that you have not been granted leave to remove any of these papers, but I am not blind to the fact that some files are designed to raise more questions than they answer." Holmes closed the folder and regarded the clerk with frank respect. "Mr. Pell, you have lived among these shadows longer than most men have breathed. Tell me, not as an official but as an observer, what impression does the name Redhaven leave upon you?" Pell hesitated, glancing briefly down the corridor to ensure we were alone. When he spoke again, his voice was low. "There are men, Mr. Holmes, whose footprints you find all over these shelves, names attached to every minor decision, each promotion, each misstep. Then there are men whose existence you infer only from gaps. Redhaven is of the latter kind. Where he appears, matters grow indistinct. Where he vanishes, the shape of certain events changes without explanation. I once remarked, half in jest, to a colleague that some benefactors prefer to stand behind the curtain while adjusting the scenery on the stage. He replied that I ought not to speak so loudly, lest the curtain learn to listen. Holmes's eyes flashed. A sensible colleague. Pell nodded. He transferred to another department shortly thereafter, or so I was told. The clerk's gaze shifted to the cylinder's faint outline beneath Holmes's coat. You carry something of consequence, Mr. Holmes. I would advise you not to trust these halls to protect it. We have no intention of leaving it here, Holmes assured him. You have assisted us more than you know. There is one further matter. May I know whether there exists any record of a Miss Amelia Harrow in connection with diplomatic or military events, concerts, commemorative performances, unofficial gatherings? Mr. Pell's eyes widened slightly at the name. Not in the official lists, but... He paused, then turned abruptly and disappeared again. When he returned, he held not a folder, but a single sheet torn from a program. It bore the heading of a private dinner held in honor of an unspoken success abroad. At the bottom, in cramped script, someone had written, "Harrow, unscheduled piece, encore requested." There is no location listed, Pell said. Only a date. But the date corresponds to an evening when several relevant gentlemen were supposedly out of London entirely, which means either the program is misdated or the dinner took place where the city could not see. Hanover Square, I murmured. Or somewhere very much like it, Holmes replied. He thanked Pell with sincere warmth and closed the folder again. As we left the archives, ascending toward the muffled hum of Whitehall, I felt the weight of what we had learned settle upon me with a heaviness very unlike certainty. Rumor and record had joined hands in a fashion that made denial difficult and acceptance more troubling still. Redhaven's gatherings, it seemed, did not merely entertain. They adjusted the course of conversations whose consequences stretched far beyond a single drawing room. On the street again, Holmes inhaled deeply as though the imperfect air of London were more welcome than the filtered dryness of the archives. "We are dealing, Watson," he said, "not with a single man's eccentricity, but with an apparatus designed to manipulate decisions in secret. Such engines rarely dismantle themselves quietly. If Redhaven vanished, it may only be because someone else now holds the controls." "And the cylinder?" I asked. "Do you believe it contains the names of those connected to this apparatus?" Holmes's hand went instinctively to his coat. "I believe it contains something someone fears we shall read. That alone makes it valuable." We walked in silence for some distance, weaving through clerks, officers, and messengers hurrying between ministries. The faces around us bore that particular London mixture of weariness and determination. I wondered how many of them had ever sensed that decisions affecting their lives might have been rehearsed in a room like Redhaven's before being announced in Parliament. As we turned toward a quieter street leading back in the direction of Baker Street, Holmes slowed. I followed his gaze. A carriage stood at the opposite corner, horse restless, harness jingling softly. Two gentlemen in sober attire alighted from it, their expressions bland, their posture unremarkable. Yet there was something too deliberate in their anonymity. One adjusted his glove, revealing for the briefest instant the gleam of a signet ring, square enclosing crescent. Holmes's face did not change, but his stride altered subtly. He guided us down a side street, neither hurrying nor lagging, as though simply choosing a different route on a whim. I knew better. We navigated a small maze of alleys and secondary roads, and did not speak until the sounds of Whitehall had thinned behind us. "Did they see us?" I asked. "They saw enough," Holmes replied. "But they will report nothing we did not intend. We have now confirmed that the ring is not merely a relic of Redhaven, but the emblem of those who continue his work. The curtain has not fallen, Watson. It has simply changed hands." We approached Baker Street under a sky gradually deepening from dull grey to early evening blue. When we entered our sitting room once more, the familiar surroundings felt altered, as if some transparent, unseen architecture had been overlaid upon the furniture and walls. The cylinder lay where Holmes had placed it earlier, now reflecting the last light of day. Holmes stood before it for a long moment, his hand resting lightly upon the back of his chair. Then he said, with quiet finality, "It is time." He opened the tin of instruments and set them gently beside the glass. As he reached for the heating coil to soften the wax, a sound drifted up from the street, faint, almost swallowed by the usual noise of traffic. I moved to the window. 5 cabs stood at various points along the road, their distribution too precise to be chance. In each, a single passenger sat, gaze lifted toward Baker Street, waiting. The circle, it seemed, had decided not to remain in the shadows any longer. They had come to listen at our door. The sight of those 5 cabs aligned along Baker Street would have drawn my suspicion on any ordinary evening. Yet that night they seemed less a coincidence than an arranged vigil. Their distribution, one near the corner, another opposite the chemist, a third beside the lamp-post, and the last 2 spaced evenly between, gave the unsettling impression of a cordon without the dignity of uniforms. Their horses shifted restlessly, iron shoes striking the stones with irregular clinks that created a strange, disjointed rhythm. And in each carriage sat a single figure, rigid and silent, faces obscured by the dimming light of the street. Holmes joined me at the window, his gaze narrowing. "They are not here to act," he murmured, "only to observe. Their presence is a note of caution, not a declaration." "They follow the cylinder," I said. Holmes inclined his head. "Or its absence, had we been foolish enough to leave it elsewhere. They wish to learn whether we trust it, whether we fear it, whether we intend to decipher it. Every inch of hesitation becomes part of their inquiry." The notion unsettled me deeply. Few matters frightened me in the manner of these watchers. Not because they threatened us openly, but because their silence conveyed an assurance that they need not speak to exert influence. It felt as though we stood in the center of a ring drawn without chalk, bounded instead by intent. Holmes pulled the curtains together, cutting off the tableau. "We must not open it tonight," he said. "To do so under observation is to place ourselves in a theater whose audience we do not choose." "But we cannot allow them to dictate our timing," I protested. "Quite so," he replied, "which is why we shall not open the cylinder in Baker Street at all." He crossed the room and gathered several items into a small leather case, tools for precision work, a lens, and 2 narrow candles. He left behind the heating coil, which could not easily be carried without attention. "Dress warmly, Watson. The night will not remain so still once we step beyond its center." We departed by the back door that opened onto the small courtyard behind Mrs. Hudson's kitchen. It was seldom used, for it required a narrow passage beside the coal chute to reach the street, but Holmes moved through it with such practiced ease that I realized he must have employed it on numerous occasions without my knowledge. We emerged not upon Baker Street, but onto a smaller lane that curved sharply toward Marylebone Road. From this vantage, the watchers could not see our exit unless they circled behind the row of houses, an action Holmes clearly wished to avoid prompting. Once on the lane, he set a brisk pace, guiding us toward Regent's Park. The lamps in that direction grew farther apart, their faint glow softened by the rolling mist that had begun to gather among the railings and tree lines. My breath formed thin clouds in the air, and the cold carried the smell of damp leaves, iron, and distant chimney smoke. "Where do we go?" I asked quietly. "To a place where one may think without interruption," Holmes answered. "A place where private steps do not echo into public curiosity." He turned onto an even narrower path that led toward the northern edge of the park. Here the gas lamps stood at such distance that their light bled faintly over the ground, insufficient to illuminate the whole, leaving patches of darkness between each post. Holmes walked with certain knowledge of the terrain, though I myself had seldom visited this side of the park at such an hour. Eventually, we reached a low iron gate, unlocked but rarely used. Beyond it lay a stretch of open ground looking toward the boating lake, now dark and still. A bench sat beside a gnarled willow whose branches drooped like mournful arms. Holmes motioned to the bench. "We shall work here," he said. "The cylinder must be opened before sunrise, or else its glass may gather dew and compromise the parchment." We sat. Holmes placed the leather case beside him, set the cylinder upon a clean handkerchief atop the bench, and drew from the case the two thin candles. He lit them with a match, shielding the flame with his hand until it steadied against the faint stirring of wind. The pale light revealed the faint inscriptions upon the wax seals, indentations too slight to form letters, yet arranged with unmistakable intent. Holmes examined them, then set to work slowly warming the wax with the flame, rotating the cylinder so no single point bore too much heat. "We must not tamper with the integrity of the parchment," he muttered. "These seals are older than Redhaven's disappearance. They may have been affixed by the man who constructed the chamber below." The wax grew glossy, pliant. Holmes used a slender blade to lift the first seal intact, placing it gently beside the candle. A faint scent rose from the warmed wax, an odor reminiscent of old libraries and long-closed trunks. He repeated the process with the second seal, preserving both without fracture. Now only the stopper remained. Holmes paused and glanced at me. "Watson," he said, "when I unstopper this vessel, whatever truth has waited within will no longer belong to shadows alone. Be prepared." I nodded, though my breath felt tight in my chest. He removed the glass cap. A faint sigh of released air escaped, air that had been trapped within the cylinder for years. Holmes angled the vessel, and the parchment slid forward with surprising smoothness. He withdrew it carefully, its surface yellowed, its edges curled inward. He unrolled it upon the handkerchief, weighting its corners with the case and the two seals. The parchment contained a grid of names. Not many, perhaps a dozen. Each was written in the same hand, though not the same ink. Some names bore a small mark beside them, a square enclosing a crescent. Beneath the list lay a diagram nearly identical to Holmes's reconstruction of the drawing room, circles, paths, and a central point near the hearth. Holmes read each name in silence. Then he read them again. One name caught the faint candlelight. Holmes's expression hardened. "Watson," he whispered, "this is no simple list of attendees." He traced one finger along the parchment to a set of symbols next to the names. Some bore a tiny cross, others a dash, and one, only one, bore the combined symbol of square and crescent repeated twice. "That," he murmured, "is the mark of the conductor, the one who led the circle." "Redhaven?" I asked. Holmes shook his head. "No, his name appears here, but without the conductor's mark." I leaned closer. "Then who?" Holmes's jaw tightened. He tapped the double-marked name. The candlelight sputtered as though reacting to the revelation. The name inscribed with double symbols, the conductor of the circle, was one I recognized from my own past, though I had never connected him to shadowed affairs. Major Roderick Avery, a soldier I once served alongside, a man I believed long dead. I stared at Holmes, my voice hollow. "But that is impossible. Avery died overseas. He never returned. I saw the report myself." Holmes rolled the parchment slightly so the symbols cast crisp shadows. "Then why is his name written here, Watson? And why marked as conductor?" I could not answer. My mind reeled with half-formed memories, Avery's steady composure, the strange letter he once sent from abroad, the rumors whispered among our regiment of a man who survived what no other could. Holmes looked at me with an intensity I'd seldom witnessed. "There is more." He turned the parchment, revealing a faint second layer of ink. Names partially erased, overwritten, yet still legible if one strained. Among them stood another surprise. Amelia Harrow, not as performer, but marked with a cross, signifying participant. Holmes exhaled sharply. The circle was larger than we imagined. Its members came from politics, the arts, the military, each bound by unspoken design. A soft sound interrupted us, a footstep upon grass. I straightened. Holmes extinguished the candles instantly. From the darkness beyond the willow, a figure approached. Slowly, steadily, the shape barely outlined by the faint glow of distant lamplight. Holmes and I rose together. "Who goes there?" Holmes called softly. The figure did not answer. As it stepped closer, the moon broke free of a passing cloud. The face that appeared in that silver glow froze the breath in my chest. For though I knew it could not be, though every rational part of me resisted the sight, it was unmistakably the face of Major Roderick Avery, alive and walking toward us. For a moment, my mind refused to reconcile the image before me with the realities I knew. The years, the distance, the report of his death, all rose like a wall between memory and sight, yet the figure approaching through the faint mist belonged unmistakably to that past. Major Roderick Avery had always carried himself with a particular economy of movement, a calm that did not soften his bearing so much as compress it into something compact and unyielding. The man who now emerged into the thin ribbon of moonlight by the willow moved with that same measured assurance. His hair, once dark, had paled at the temples, but the line of the jaw, the set of the shoulders, the steady, unhurried gaze, they had changed only by the natural passage of time. If I had seen him across a parade ground, I would have named him without an instant's doubt. "Avery," I breathed, scarcely aware that I spoke aloud. Holmes did not take his eyes from the man. "You know him, then?" he said quietly. "Yes," I managed, my throat tight. "From the service. We were stationed together. Years ago, I attended his memorial." The man halted a few paces away, just beyond the last fading embers of candle scent. His gloved hands were empty, his coat unbuttoned at the throat as though he had walked a considerable distance at a moderate pace. He inclined his head with grave courtesy, first to Holmes, then to me. "Dr. Watson?" he said in a voice that sent a shiver through me, so perfectly did it match the tones I recalled from bivouacs and field hospitals. I'd hoped it would not be you. The words struck with a curious mixture of familiarity and dread. "Major Avery," I replied, recovering a measure of composure. "Either you stand before us in the flesh, or my mind has surrendered entirely to this case." "The reports of your death were convenient," he interrupted gently, "and necessary." Holmes stepped forward by a fraction, his posture relaxed, but his attention keen. "Major Avery, I presume," he said. "You have the advantage of knowing my friend. I, on the other hand, must rely upon fragments and a name inked twice upon a piece of parchment concealed beneath a drawing-room hearth. You have arrived at a propitious moment." Avery's gaze flickered briefly to the folded parchment upon the bench between us, then returned to Holmes. "I've arrived too late," he said. "That document was never meant to be opened by men outside the circle, least of all by one with your particular proclivities, Mr. Holmes." "I'm honored," Holmes replied dryly. "One seldom hears one's name uttered as though it were an instrument." Avery's expression remained unreadable. "An instrument can be turned aside if met early enough. You have been allowed to come too far. The others grow impatient." "The others," Holmes repeated. "Those who chose to watch Baker Street from hired cabs rather than test their courage upon my threshold." Avery's lips curved in the faintest shadow of a smile. "You misunderstand. Those men tonight were not sent to threaten you. They were sent to measure you. a difference you, of all people, should appreciate. Holmes's hand rested lightly upon the glass cylinder in his coat. They measured and found what? That you would not open the record while under observation, Avery replied, which confirms what I already told them, that you value control over audience. It is why you are dangerous, and why your friend here is the true risk. I felt the weight of his gaze settle upon me anew. Explain yourself, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. You are not bound by the habits of secrecy that govern the rest of us, Avery said. You write, you record, you speak of what you have seen. Holmes may solve a problem and set it aside as complete. You, Doctor, give it a second life by telling others. That is admirable in a world that values truth. It is less so in ours. Holmes took a half-step closer, placing himself subtly between Avery and the bench. Which world is that, Major? The trenches and campaigns you and Watson knew? Or the one that built secret chambers beneath houses where men walked in circles until they forgot whether they volunteered their conscience or surrendered it? For the first time, something like pain crossed Avery's face. You have seen the cellar, he murmured. Then you know more than I had hoped. The drawings, the circles, the calculations. Redhaven described them to me before the house existed. He believed that configuration could make the mind more receptive to certain ideas, that in a space without corners, where movement never halted at a wall, men might become willing to follow thoughts they would otherwise resist. And you lent him your experience, Holmes said, as a man who had seen how soldiers respond to constrained space and controlled rhythm. The march, the drill, the endless repetition until will and motion become indistinguishable. Avery's jaw tightened. I lent him nothing he did not already possess. He sought me because something in my service record suggested I understood how fear and loyalty intertwine. I thought, foolishly, that by helping him devise a safer stage, we might avoid bloodshed elsewhere. Words exchanged in drawing rooms rather than bullets in the field. Influence in place of violence. Holmes's eyes glinted. And yet there is a body in the Thames bearing the same velvet as the scrap beneath your house. Explain to me how your method chose words over violence there. A shadow passed across Avery's features. For the first time since his arrival, he seemed less like a composed presence and more like a man carrying the weight of choices made in another decade. He looked away briefly toward the dark line of the lake. Not all who joined the circle understood its original purpose, he said. Some saw in it an opportunity to steer decisions for their own gain. When Redhaven withdrew, I tried to dismantle what we had built. I failed. Do you understand, Holmes? I failed. So I died. Conveniently, Holmes murmured. Conveniently, Avery agreed with bitter calm. Dead men cannot be summoned to gatherings. They cannot be bound by new oaths. They cannot be forced to step into light they no longer control. I believed that by leaving the stage, I might let the curtain fall. And yet someone continued the performance, Holmes said. Someone wearing the seal we have seen upon more than one hand these last days. Avery's gaze hardened. You have seen the ring? More than once, Holmes replied, upon the hand of a man who called upon Madame Arvel at the opera, in the street near Whitehall, and if I am not mistaken, upon the finger of the corpse Lestrade drew from the river. Your circle has not merely persisted, Major, it has begun to prune itself. A brief silence followed. The mist drifted closer, cloaking the lower branches of the willow. Avery stepped nearer until I could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the slight scar along his left cheekbone, an old wound I remembered from a night when shrapnel had carved fire through the air. You have the record, he said to Holmes. Do you know what each symbol signifies? Holmes considered him. Some, but not all. The double mark beside your name was simple to infer. The crosses near certain others likely denote commitment to particular decisions. The dashes may signify opposition, abstention, or merely observation. There is, however, one mark whose meaning eludes me. The cross beside Amelia Harrow. Avery's composure faltered. Amelia, he repeated softly. You found her name there? Yes, Holmes answered. Not as a performer, as participant. Avery turned away, his shoulders stiffening. When he faced us again, his eyes held a quiet sorrow that cut deeper than any display of anger. She was never meant to stand in that circle, he said. She came to sing, that was all. Redhaven asked me to ensure she felt safe within the house. Instead, I led her to the very room that set the snare. When the first gathering convened, she remained outside the ring. But on the second night, one of the men insisted she walk the pattern with them, merely as an experiment, he claimed. Hearing the music from within the circle, he said, might unlock some new quality in her performance. His voice tightened. The room was not built for her. The echo pressed upon her in ways it did not upon hardened men. When she stepped into the beam of moonlight, her expression changed. Something in her broke or revealed itself. I cannot say which. She left the house that night with eyes that did not see the street. Afterward, she sang differently. Better, some said. Others found her unsettling. And then she vanished, I said. Avery nodded once. I believed she had gone abroad. Then, months later, word reached me that she had been seen near the river, speaking with a man who now bears the double mark beside his own name in the later entries. Not Redhaven. Someone else. The circle had chosen a new conductor. Who? Holmes demanded, his calm thinning. Avery hesitated. The wind shifted, stirring the surface of the lake. Somewhere in the distance a watchman's rattle sounded, then faded. He will know I have spoken if I name him, Avery said. Holmes's voice grew soft and very dangerous. He already knows you have spoken, Major. You came here tonight. You approached us while we worked. If the circle observes as keenly as you claim, your silence now will not save you. It will only blind us. Avery exhaled slowly. Very well. The man you seek, the man who now wears the ring as conductor of the gatherings, is not a stranger to your investigations, Mr. Holmes. He has moved among cases you have touched without your knowledge, always in the second rank, always behind another face. He looked directly at me as he spoke the name, though his words were meant for Holmes. Sir Alistair Farnham. The name struck some buried chord in my memory, though I could not immediately place it. A financier, perhaps, a patron. A man glimpsed at the periphery of society, functions I had attended in the wake of certain celebrated cases. His presence had never been central enough to command attention, yet he was always there, near men whose troubles had brought them to Holmes. Holmes's expression altered in a way I'd seen only a handful of times, when a shape, long suspected, suddenly took definitive form. Farnham, he murmured. Of course. Avery stepped back, as though distance could protect him from the implications of the name he had uttered. You have what you came for, he said. The record, the conductor's identity, the knowledge that the circle did not die with Redhaven. Now you must do what I could not. And what is that? I asked. End it, Avery replied, before the next gathering, before the drawing room is full again. Holmes opened his mouth to speak, but at that moment the sound of wheels upon gravel reached us. A cab emerged from the darkness at the park's edge, moving slowly along the path where no cab ordinarily traveled. Its lamps burned low. Its driver hunched against the cold. Avery's head snapped toward it, his expression suddenly alert with something like dread. They have found us, he said. How? I demanded. We left Baker Street by the back way. The circle has more eyes than cabs. Avery cut in. They have followed me for years. They know when I stray too near the stage I abandoned. The cab drew to a halt some distance away. Its door remained closed. The horse snorted, breath pluming in the cold. Avery stepped backward into the shadow of the willow. This meeting never occurred, he said quietly. If you mention me to them, they will deny I exist. If you mention me to those outside the circle, they will call you mad. Use the record. Use your own eyes. Trust the man beside you more than any document. His gaze lingered upon me a moment longer. "I'm sorry, Doctor," he added in a voice scarcely above a whisper. "I never intended that your path would cross this one again." Then, before we could move to detain or question him further, he turned and in 2 strides was gone into the deeper darkness beyond the willow, swallowed by the mist and the curved rise of the ground. The cab remained where it was, door still closed, as though waiting not for him, but for us. Holmes laid a hand upon my arm, restraining me from pursuit. "Let him go," he said softly. "For now, his survival depends upon remaining a rumor rather than a witness." We stood between the dim candles' ghosts and the watching cab. The parchment rolled once more, the cylinder empty, yet more burdened in absence than it had been in secrecy. The horse stamped, its iron shoe striking a jagged spark from the stone. The cab did not move. Nor did we. And in the distance, far beyond park and river and squares, I could not shake the sense that a drawing-room none of us presently occupied was already preparing itself. Carpet smoothed, chairs arranged, silence thickening, for footsteps that had not yet begun. We did not move for several breaths, Holmes and I standing between the faint imprint of candle wax cooling on the bench and the silent cab whose lamps glowed like watchful eyes in the damp distance. Regent's Park, so often a refuge of quiet contemplation, felt suddenly compressed, its wide lawns narrowed by an invisible pressure, its gentle paths somehow bearing the weight of intent. Even the trees seemed to lean inward, as though overhearing something not yet spoken. The horse before the cab pawed once at the gravel, then stood perfectly still, its breath rising in small white clouds. Holmes's hand slipped from my arm only when he was certain I would not rush forward in some instinctive, misguided hope of catching Avery's retreating shadow. There was reason in his restraint, for I felt at that moment a curious tug within myself. An impulse formed from equal parts memory, disbelief, and the soldier's reflex to pursue a comrade who flees toward danger rather than away from it. But Avery's vanishing into the night had held no desperation in it, only inevitability. Holmes bent and gathered the remaining tools, extinguished the lingering flame of the candles, and wrapped the parchment inside his coat. When he straightened again, he faced the unmoving cab with an expression that could not be mistaken for fear nor for bravado, only for calculation. "They will wait," he murmured. "Men of this nature do not act without ensuring the stage is set. Observe the driver's posture, tension but no signal to the horse. They are watching whether we approach or retreat." "Do they intend to follow us?" I asked. Holmes gave a brief nod. "Of course, but we must give them nothing more tonight." He turned away from the cab with the deliberate composure of a man declining a duel before witnesses and motioned me toward a narrow path leading out of the park by an indirect route. The cab did not pursue. It remained where it stood long after we stepped out of sight, as though marking a place rather than guarding a person. We walked in silence for some minutes, the lamps thinning, the mist thickening. Only when we reached a quieter road bordering Portland Place did Holmes finally speak. "You recognize the man unequivocally," he said. "Yes," I replied, "beyond any shadow of doubt." Roderick Avery stood no more than 10 paces from us. His voice, his bearing, even the scar on his cheek, they were all precisely as I remembered. "And yet," Holmes said softly, "the world has believed him dead for years. His record," he added with faint emphasis, "was among those sealed under considerable discretion. Few men die so neatly when their death serves another purpose." The vial now hidden in Holmes's coat seemed suddenly heavier, as though the parchment inside reacted to the revelation of Avery's continued existence. I could not shake the memory of his eyes, still sharp, still steady, yet shadowed by something I had never seen in him before. Not fear, but weariness sharpened to desperation. "He said Farnham is the new conductor," I murmured. "But how does one man, however wealthy or well-connected, take control of such a design?" Holmes paused beneath a lamp, its light outlining his features with stark clarity. "Power in such circles is not taken," he said. "It is inherited, through absence, through fear, or through the careful orchestration of circumstance." When Redhaven withdrew, the circle did not dissolve. It merely awaited a voice commanding enough to align its members anew. Farnham, it seems, has cultivated that voice. We resumed our walk. A carriage passed us, then another, but these bore only late travellers, not watchers. The city's pulse resumed its natural cadence, yet the memory of the cab in the park lingered like a stain upon the night. When at last we reached Baker Street, the lamps burned lower than usual, giving the familiar facades an unfamiliar cast. Our own door bore no sign of disturbance, though Holmes inspected the handle, the window-sill, and the threshold with habitual scrutiny before permitting us entry. Inside, the fire still smouldered from earlier in the evening. Holmes replaced the parchment and cylinder in his locked tin box, securing it with a mechanism only he could open, then placed the box on the mantel, where the faint heat from the embers would prevent moisture from forming upon the glass. I sat in my armchair, hands clasped to still the trembling that I had not fully acknowledged until then. Holmes poured 2 modest glasses of brandy and handed one to me. I drank, feeling the warmth spread through my chest, easing the tightness left by the night's events. "You are quiet," he observed. "How does one speak?" I replied, "after witnessing a dead man walk calmly into the moonlight to warn us of danger still alive?" Holmes's gaze softened. "You and I have seen death misreported more than once." "Yes," I conceded, "but seldom with such purpose." He seated himself opposite me, stretching his long legs toward the fire. "Avery's appearance confirms more than he intended to reveal. The circle feared him. They required him removed from their gatherings, but not gone so completely that he could not be reintroduced as a rumor should the need arise. His death was a convenience, as he said. His re-emergence is a threat to them, and perhaps a test for us." "For us?" I asked. Holmes nodded. He revealed Farnham's name. Either he defied the circle to do so, or he was permitted to do so for reasons we do not yet grasp. In either case, we must act swiftly. He stood and approached the map upon the table, London in its maze of districts, marked with small pins and scraps of paper. He placed a new pin at the Strand, another near the Opera House, a third in Hanover Square, and a fourth, hesitating only briefly, near Whitehall. "These points form a pattern," he murmured, "not of geography, but of influence. Each location holds a memory of a meeting, a manipulation, or a decision rehearsed before being declared. If we follow these connections, they will lead us not merely to Farnham, but to the place where he intends to summon the circle again." "And where is that?" I asked. Holmes tapped his finger lightly upon the map. "There," he said. "Chancery Lane. Near the old chambers, a place steeped in secrecy and silence, the ideal setting for a gathering unseen." Before I could ask how he knew, a faint sound interrupted us, a soft rustle drifting from the corridor like fabric brushing wood. Holmes's posture stiffened. He gestured to me to remain still and moved toward the door with slow, deliberate steps. The corridor was empty. Holmes crossed to the staircase and listened. No movement. He descended 2 steps, then 3, pausing at each. Still nothing. When he returned, his face was composed, yet his voice held a tension I rarely heard. "They have entered the house," he said. "At some hour before we returned, someone crossed the threshold. No window has been disturbed, no lock tampered with. Yet there is a faint scent upon the staircase, candle soot mixed with something else." "What do you mean?" Holmes met my gaze. "Velvet," he said. "A trace of the same dye used upon the scraps we found. Faint, but present. You believe someone wearing that garment, or carrying its remnants, was here?" "Yes," Holmes replied. "And if they entered without taking the cylinder or harming our visitor, then their purpose was neither theft nor murder." Then what? Holmes looked toward the mantel where the tin box rested securely. They wished to see whether we had opened the record, whether the circle's mark had been revealed, whether Avery had spoken. They wished to measure us, Watson, just as the watchers in the cabs measured us. He exhaled, long and low. The circle is no longer observing from afar. They have crossed our threshold. I stood, unable to remain seated any longer. Then we are no longer pursuing this case alone, Holmes. We are being pursued. Holmes nodded once, gravely. We have entered the circle's design, he said. And unlike Redhaven's guests, we were not invited. Outside, a carriage passed, its wheels muffled on the wet road. The house seemed suddenly enormous and fragile, filled with corners where sound could hide and shadows where watchers might linger unseen. I glanced at the door. Holmes did as well. Neither of us spoke the thought forming in both our minds. The next footstep we heard might not be ours. The following day unfolded under a sky drained of color, as though London itself had been bled of vibrancy to leave only grays and browns, suitable for ledgers and secrets. Holmes rose early, which in his case meant only that he shifted from contemplation to action. The map remained upon the table, pins in their places, the new one at Chancery Lane like a small wound in the paper. The tin box upon the mantel had not moved in the night, yet every time my gaze wandered toward it I felt an involuntary tightening, as if some part of me expected to see it open of its own accord. Holmes took no breakfast, existing as he often did on little more than tobacco and agitation. The cylinder, now emptied of its parchment, lay upon the mantelpiece beside the box, a relic that seemed somehow more ominous in transparency than it had in secrecy. The parchment itself he had locked away again after making a precise copy in his own disciplined hand. Symbols and names reproduced without embellishment. As I watched him work, his pen moving swiftly yet carefully across the page, I reflected that there was in Holmes something not unlike the circle he now opposed. A pattern of thought so exacting it could, if misdirected, exert a power over others' minds. The difference, I reminded myself, lay in his choice to reveal rather than conceal. By early afternoon, he had dispatched a note to Lestrade requesting a private consultation. The reply came back more quickly than I expected. The inspector would meet us at a quiet tea-room off Fleet Street, a place sufficiently modest to discourage the presence of those more concerned, with appearances than substance. We arrived to find Lestrade already there, hat upon the chair beside him, hands wrapped around a cup that had clearly long gone cold. He rose as we approached, offering me a curt nod and Holmes a look that blended exasperation with reluctant respect. "You choose your cases as a man chooses storms," he said by way of greeting. "You walk straight into them and expect the rest of us to bring umbrellas." Holmes gave a faint inclination of the head. "You received my message, then. I trust its lack of detail did not trouble you." "On the contrary," Lestrade replied. "When you speak vaguely, I assume the matter is either trivial or dangerous. Recent experience has taught me to guess the latter." He reseated himself and lowered his voice. "The man from the river has been identified. I thought you might have guessed who he was before we did." Holmes rested his fingertips lightly upon the table. "Humor me." "Sir Edwin Mallory," Lestrade said. "A baronet, business interests in shipping, some property in the country, and, according to those who know such things, a talent for appearing in the right drawing-rooms at the right time. No obvious enemies, no overt scandal, and no reason anyone can see for him to end up in the Thames with his skull fractured and his cuff torn." "Ah," Holmes murmured. "Mallory. Yes. I recall him as a man who laughed with his mouth and not his eyes." Lestrade's brows rose. "You knew him?" "I know the type," Holmes replied. "Did he bear any mark upon his person beyond the velvet scrap?" Lestrade hesitated. "There was a ring, not upon his finger, in his pocket. Square shape around some sort of crescent design. I took it for a family crest." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "Where is it now?" In evidence, Lestrade answered, though I suppose you'll want to see it. I suppose I shall. Lestrade leaned closer. Holmes, I will go so far as to say this much. I know when a death is an isolated misfortune and when it belongs to something larger. This one belongs. Men have been watching the yard since we pulled that body from the water. Polished men who speak softly and ask nothing directly, but whose presence suggests they consider themselves stakeholders. Stakeholders in secrecy, Holmes said. You are correct. The death of Sir Edwin Mallory is neither random nor solitary. It is one in a series of adjustments made within a closed circle. Tell me, Lestrade, do you recall ever encountering the name Sir Alistair Farnham in connection with any case you were prevented from fully pursuing? Lestrade frowned, thinking, Farnham? Not often. Once in relation to a banking inquiry that was abruptly reassigned. Another time in passing, someone said he had interceded to help secure leniency for a friend of his, but his name seldom appears on paper. Why? Because he conducts the circle to which Mallory belonged, Holmes said, and because he will convene them again, soon, and not in any public chamber. Lestrade stared at him, eyes narrowing. You're not speaking of a club or society, are you? No, Holmes replied. I'm speaking of something far less formal and far more binding. Men like Mallory, Redhaven, and others whose names you would recognize have been meeting for years in spaces constructed specifically to shape their decisions. Rooms designed to make certain courses of action feel inevitable. Redhaven's house held one such room. There are others. Lestrade's mouth tightened. You will forgive me if I say this sounds like the sort of talk that gets people dismissed from their posts, not promoted. Holmes's expression did not shift. You asked once how some scandals never reach your desk, Lestrade. This is how. Conclusions are rehearsed elsewhere before you are asked to investigate their consequences. If you wish to keep the law from becoming a mere spectator, you must be willing to stand where these rehearsals occur. And where is that? Chancery Lane, Holmes said simply. Near the old chambers. We have reason to believe the circle will gather there. I intend to be present when they do. Lestrade looked from him to me and back again. Present in what capacity? As an observer, Holmes answered. As a man in the audience rather than upon the stage. The difference is vital. They must not know we see the full pattern, or they will move their performance elsewhere. This is madness, Lestrade muttered, though there was less conviction in it than usual. You propose that we infiltrate a gathering of influential men whose idea of privacy is walls, guards, and the absence of written records. If you are correct, Holmes, they will not hesitate to crush anyone who threatens their arrangement. Which is why you will not attend in any official capacity, Holmes said. You will be nearby, with enough men to intervene should our position become untenable. But the watching, we shall do that ourselves. Lestrade drummed his fingers once upon the table. You place me in a difficult position. I place you in an honest one, Holmes replied. You may choose discretion and allow matters to continue as they have, or you may risk stepping beyond the usual bounds of procedure to glimpse the machinery that moves your cases before you receive them. After a long moment, Lestrade let out a breath that might have been a sigh or a quiet oath. Very well. I will arrange a discreet presence near Chancery Lane. But understand, Holmes, if this ends in scandal, I will have little shield to offer you. Holmes's smile held no mockery. You underestimate your own courage, Inspector. We parted soon after, leaving Lestrade to wrestle with the implications of our conversation. Outside, the city moved along its accustomed channels, oblivious to the possibility that decisions shaping its fate might soon be made, or unmade, in a single room. As evening fell, the clouds thickened into a uniform dark blanket, promising no moonlight to guide or betray. Holmes regarded this with a mixture of regret and approval. They will prefer the cover, he remarked, as we dressed in darker, simpler clothes than usual. Circles such as these adore symbolism, but they love safety more. we took no cab. Instead, we walked toward Chancery Lane by indirect routes, blending with clerks, errand boys, and late-working solicitors. The further we went, the more the architecture seemed to close in. Tall, austere buildings with narrow windows, doorways framed by pillars, plaques bearing names known only to those who dealt in litigation and delayed verdicts. Holmes slowed as we approached a particular row of chambers facing a small recessed courtyard. The entrance to one building stood slightly apart from the rest, its door freshly painted, its brass fixtures polished. No business name marked the lintel, only a discreet number and, to a patient eye, the faintest sign of additional scuffing near the threshold, as though more feet had passed there than its apparent neglect would suggest. "There," Holmes said softly. "Do you see the pattern of carriage tracks near the curb? Multiple arrivals, all within the space of an hour, none lingering. The lamps above the entrance are lit, though the curtains within remain drawn. A room prepared for a gathering not recorded in any diary." We positioned ourselves in the shadow of a passage opposite, partially concealed by a protruding corner of brick. From there we could see the door clearly without being immediately visible. The courtyard held only a thin scattering of pedestrians, most intent on their own affairs. Minutes passed, marked only by the occasional rattle of wheels and the distant toll of a church clock. Then a carriage turned into the lane, halted briefly, and released a single passenger, a man of medium height in a dark coat, his hat pulled low. We could not see his face. He ascended the short flight of steps and knocked once. The door opened almost at once and admitted him. Another cab followed, then another. Each delivered one passenger, alone, each greeted by a door that seemed to open just before the knocker could fully descend, as though those inside had calculated the timing of each arrival. None of the men glanced around. They behaved as those do who are accustomed to entering places where being seen is not a concern, because those who see would not dare to speak. Holmes's eyes missed nothing. You observe, Watson, that none wear obvious insignia. Yet several carry their left hands close to their bodies, concealing their fingers. Habits are difficult to stifle. "Do you think Farnham is already within?" I asked. "I would wager so," Holmes replied. "Conductors prefer to arrive early." The lane grew quieter as the flow of carriages ceased. The last man to enter did so, on foot, emerging from a side street, and pausing only briefly to glance up at the windows of the building before slipping inside. There was something in his posture, a fluid confidence that struck a chord of recognition. "Farnham?" I whispered. Holmes's lips pressed into a thin line. "We shall know soon enough." He touched my arm and led me along the passage to a narrow alley that ran behind the row of chambers. Here the walls pressed closer, the air cooled by stone and shadow. Rubbish bins and crates lined the path, yet Holmes stepped through them with the ease of one who had studied such environments often. We reached a small courtyard at the back, where several doors and staircases led into the building from the rear. Holmes approached one unmarked door and knelt to examine the lock. His fingers moved with practiced deftness, and within moments the mechanism yielded. We slipped inside. The corridor beyond was dim and smelled of paper, ink, and old dust. We climbed a narrow staircase, pausing at each landing to listen. Faintly, from somewhere above, came the murmur of voices. Low, controlled, blending into a single, indistinct tone rather than distinct phrases. Holmes led us toward it, stopping at last before an inner door whose wood was thicker than those below, its keyhole recently polished. He gestured for silence. Through the crack beneath the door, a faint line of light reached the floor. The murmur of voices grew clearer, though words remained obscured by distance and barrier. Yet there was another sound beneath them, a measured rhythm, soft and repetitive. Footsteps, not random, a pattern. Holmes lowered himself and placed his ear gently against the panel. I watched the tension in his shoulders as he listened. My own heart beat hard enough, it seemed, to drown the subtler noises of the gathering beyond. Finally, he drew back, eyes shadowed. "They are walking," he whispered, "in a circle." He pointed to the ceiling above. "And if these chambers share the same architect as Hanover Square, then beneath this room lies another, unseen." We stood in the narrow corridor, separated from the circle by little more than wood and the reluctance of sound to surrender its secrets. The voices rose slightly, then fell, as though someone within had taken the central position and begun to speak in tones pitched just below the level of comprehension. Holmes closed his eyes briefly, as if composing himself. "Watson," he breathed, "we are at the edge of a design that has shaped more than one man's fate. What happens in that room tonight will reverberate far beyond these walls." As if in answer, a sudden hush fell within. The footsteps ceased. Then, chillingly, there came a single knock upon the floor from inside, 3 firm taps in quick succession. Holmes and I stared at the door. For an instant, in that cramped corridor, I could not escape the sensation that whoever knocked was not summoning those within to attention, but acknowledging those listening without. The 3 knocks reverberated through the door with a clarity that defied the thickness of the wood. They were not loud, yet they possessed a quality that seemed to still the air around us, as though the corridor itself held its breath. Holmes's expression did not change, but I sensed the alteration in his posture. A tightening, a narrowing, a mind adjusting its calculations in the instant between one heartbeat and the next. Inside the room, silence held. It was not the silence of uncertainty or confusion, but the unmistakable pause of men listening for something beyond themselves. The knock had meant something to them, a signal, a cue, or a warning. Holmes leaned slightly nearer to the keyhole, though I knew even he could see nothing through it. The construction was too precise. He placed 2 fingertips upon the door, not pushing, not testing, merely feeling. "They know we are here," he murmured. My pulse quickened. "How?" "We moved without sound." Holmes shook his head faintly. "Not sound. Expectation. The circle anticipates intrusion as one anticipates weather, an inevitable shift, no matter how predictable the calm beforehand. We were always meant to reach this threshold. The question is whether they prefer us outside the door or inside it." His gaze shifted to the floorboards beneath our feet. "There is another chamber below," he whispered again, more to himself than to me. "There must be." Before I could form a reply, a sudden swell of voices rose from the room, still blurred, but now clearly responding to some command or declaration made in quiet tones we could not discern. The footsteps resumed, though differently now, not in the continuous rhythm of circular motion, but in measured intervals, as though individuals repositioned themselves within a fixed design. Holmes's eyes sharpened. "They are preparing to begin." "Begin what?" I sounded more strained than I intended. He did not answer. Instead, he motioned for us to retreat a few paces down the corridor. We moved silently, keeping to the shadows. As we did, the door opened. Not fully, not far, but just enough for a narrow band of light to join the dim corridor. A man's silhouette appeared, though we could see only the outline of his shoulder and side. He did not step out. He merely listened. After several seconds, the door closed again, with the soft, deliberate finality of a decision made. Holmes exhaled. "We have 2 choices, Watson," he said quietly. "Enter the gathering uninvited, or descend to the chamber below and learn their intent without revealing our presence." I glanced toward the stairwell leading down into darkness. "But we do not know whether there is a way through from the lower rooms." "We shall discover it," he replied. "They would not risk exposure by designing only one route of entry." He moved swiftly toward the back stairs, and I followed, though every instinct warned me of the danger in descending into unknown depths while the gathering above continued its unseen ritual. The staircase led us down one narrow flight, then another. The building's lower levels bore the unmistakable chill of long-neglected spaces. Air heavy with dust, stone darker than necessary, light barely reaching into corners. A single lantern mounted upon the wall flickered as we passed, revealing crumbling mortar and an old plaque marking the chambers above. At the bottom of the stairs, a corridor waited, unlit except for the faintest glimmer from a distant grate. Holmes paused to listen. The murmur from above was faint, yet distinctly present, as though sound traveled through the stone itself. He moved forward. The corridor branched twice, once to the right, once to the left. Holmes chose the left path without hesitation. "Air displacement," he whispered. "The draft moves subtly toward this side. There is space beyond." We advanced along the corridor until we reached a heavy wooden door secured by a rusted latch. Holmes knelt, examined it, and lifted the latch with a slow, practiced movement. The door opened inward with a groan so soft it seemed to retreat from itself. Beyond lay a room far larger than I expected. Its walls curved not sharply but in a gentle arc, as though forming a partial circle. The ceiling, low at the edges, rose subtly toward the center. And directly beneath where we believed the gathering in the room above to be, the stones formed a pattern, interlocking arcs echoing the circular impressions of Redhaven's cellar. Holmes stepped inside, his lantern raised just high enough to illuminate the space without touching its far edges. "This," he said softly, "is the chamber beneath the chamber." I followed him inward, the air colder now, thick with the unmistakable stillness of a place built for secrecy rather than comfort. The floor bore faint marks, smoothed grooves following arcs similar to those we had traced before. But here, the pattern was clearer, more deliberate. Holmes knelt to examine one groove. "They rehearse decisions above," he murmured, "but conclusions are seeded below. The upper circle acts upon the lower circle's shape." As he rose, a faint sound drifted through the ceiling above, a man's voice speaking distinctly now, though the words remained unintelligible. Then another voice, then three at once, overlapping. Holmes extinguished the lantern. We stood in darkness. "I must hear them clearly," Holmes whispered. "Sound carries through the stone. Give your ears a moment to adjust." I obeyed, though the sudden darkness seemed to press against me. Slowly, the murmur resolved into distinct qualities, deep voices, lighter tones, the subtle cadence of a man commanding attention, not by volume, but by authority. Avery's warning echoed in my mind. "Farnham." Holmes moved closer to the center of the chamber. "There is a vent here," he whispered, directly above us. Indeed, as I strained to listen, the voices sharpened, still indistinct in meaning but clearer in tone. One voice, calm, assured, with a particular cadence, spoke longer than the others. The room above fell silent as he did. When his voice ceased, several others responded briefly, almost ritualistically. "What is he saying?" I whispered. Holmes shook his head slightly. "Not enough clarity to decipher, but there is intent in the pattern. He speaks, they respond, a leader directing a circle." Footsteps followed, slow, clockwise pacing, one man at a time. Each step resonated faintly through the stone. Then something else joined the chorus, a sound not of footsteps nor voices, but of metal brushing stone. Holmes froze. "They are lowering something," he whispered. "A mechanism." Before I could ask where or why, a beam of faint light pierced the darkness from above, a narrow, slender line descending from the ceiling like a thread of moonlight. It widened, slowly, revealing a seam in the stone. Holmes seized my arm and pulled me aside just as a circular section of the ceiling above began to turn, silently, with mechanical precision. A hidden aperture, not large enough for a man, but wide enough to admit something else. Holmes hissed, "Stay against the wall, now." We flattened ourselves against the curved stone as the aperture rotated fully open. From the room above, a rope descended, thick, braided, knotted at intervals. At its end hung a wooden crate the size of a small chest. The crate swung lightly as it reached the floor, the rope swaying like a pendulum. Voices from above fell silent. Then a single command sounded through the ceiling, soft, firm, unmistakable. "Open it." Holmes and I stared at the crate on the chamber floor. It had been lowered, not to those above, but for whoever waited below. Holmes's voice, when it came, was scarcely a breath. "They expect someone else." And in the suffocating silence that followed, we heard footsteps descending from the far corridor, the sound of a person approaching the lower chamber with deliberate, measured tread.